In a quiet town, someone talks to the protagonist, praising him for having come so far and defeated many strong enemies. The hero looks at him, receiving the praise with humility and modesty. In front of him stood a massive beast, the Demon King. He says that, as a reward for his services, he should disappear into the twilight with his help. However, the blonde affirms he would not let that happen, because the bond he formed with his friends pushed him forward in life. With a crazed look, he yells that the voices of his companions strengthened him, and the power of his friendship would never let him down. In that case, the king challenges him. He wanted to know if all that strength could save him that day. Faced with the challenge, the protagonist prepares his shield, while the beast grabs him with just one hand, lifting him to look into his eyes. Then, mocking the supposed power he had, he calls him a fool, before crushing him with his massive fist. Celebrating the obvious victory, he tells his subordinates that the conquest would continue, and several explosions occur in the city. Its peace is interrupted by one of his servants, who urgently calls for the Demon King. He asks what they wanted with him, and the man explains it was the hero entering the castle again. However, the monarch explains that the hero was right there, but he soon realizes he was completely wrong. Within seconds, his skeleton was already there, making the king wonder where all his equipment had gone. It is then that our boy reappears, completely intact, and raising his sword, he declares that this time he would definitely destroy him. Rising from the throne, the monster claims he didn't know how the boy had done it, but he shouts that he could come back as many times as he wanted. After all, nothing would make a difference. And consumed by his despair, he claims he would be the one to dig his grave. The king launches flames toward the boy, flames strong enough to destroy the things around them, and to scorch the boy. However, the blonde reappears in front of him, as if nothing had happened. He reemerges, leaving everyone confused, and the boy explains he possesses a resurrection amulet, and summons the Demon King to the start of what would be the true battle. The creature is shocked by the boy's ability to come back to life, questioning how he managed to return so easily, as he did not do that so quickly. The MC asks what powers the hero was using, and the blonde replies that his resurrection wasn't any kind of new technique, and he even found it curious that the Demon King didn't know of its existence. In response to the human's insolence, the king yells that his subordinates had already felt his wrath and he should have listened to them. But the boy says he doesn't think of his friends as inferior, even if they're subordinates, because the power of their bonds was greater than the Demon King's rules, which made no sense to the creature because resurrection had nothing to do with people's friendships. However, the beast does not back down and claims he has no problem continuing to finish off the protagonist until he stops coming back. The two then enter a constant clash. The king couldn't take it anymore after Meg returns of the boy and could only wonder why he never broke. There was nothing he could do. It was as if he were trapped in an eternal nightmare. It was truly absurd, and there was the hero again in front of him, standing with his equipment intact, stating that the two had reached the end. With his sword, he manages to land a precise blow on the monster, who roars. From then on, the hero doesn't stop, striking him with multiple blows. Some the king manages to dodge, others less so, until his head and spine fall to the ground along with part of his body. Even so, he tries to cling to reality, saying he would not give up. However, the battle between the two ends with the boy victorious that same day. After some time, the hero returned to the capital, and for many years, the citizens spoke of his story. They talk about his legendary feat, yet the story was not over, because it didn't take long for the protagonist to reappear in his tomb. If he hadn't split a piece of his soul into the soul bank, his body would have been completely destroyed. But now that he was back, he could take control of the situation. He walks to a small lake near the cemetery and looks at his reflection, thinking about the items he lost, which was expected from that temporary body. Before anything else, there was something he needed to do, but he is interrupted when his soul tries to leave his body, and he quickly grabs it, and he shouts, asserting this fact, until he hears someone speaking in the middle of the forest and wonders who it could be. The MC yells for the person to answer. Then a small blob comes rolling out from the bushes. Apparently, it was just a slime, a very common type of creature around there, which quickly explodes. Faced with this, the man returns to his usual arrogant posture, claiming to be the king of kings, the controller of all plagues, and introduces himself as the Lord of Agnin. The little blob quickly jumps away from there, catching his attention, making him question how a blob dared to leave him alone, and says he would show it his true power. So he summons a magic circle, wishing for the little creature to suffer from his powers. Then he intones the original fire, which was supposed to be something grand, but ends up summoning a small campfire that is almost like lighting a match, which was quite anticlimactic. He claims that this was not the kind of fire he was thinking of, but rather the fire of origins, which had to be something magical and mysterious. Seeing that it wouldn't lead anywhere, he decides to use his physical strength to finish off the blob. He tries to jump on it without any success because the little creature manages to hit his face effortlessly. He remembers how he used to be the only powerful one, and the other creatures there were inferior. That thing was probably another brainless species, only caring about numbers. Mocking it, he concludes it should be happy for surviving another day. That didn't make them great beasts. He continues smashing the little creature that sticks to him, making the blob bounce quickly. He didn't know why it wasn't working, since he was the king of all monsters and the lord of the origin of the world. He had already conquered endless lands and gotten everything he wanted. Moreover, he was known for spreading eternal tyranny. That was his life's purpose. Yet now he couldn't even defeat a blob of slime that kept jumping around. Until it goes toward his head again, leaving a sort of little kiss. He could feel the slime's feelings and thoughts after that. Basically, it was saying he was a terrible guy, calling himself Demon King, and admired his high self-esteem. The monster responds that the blob didn't understand anything, and that it wasn't some kind of fan of the Demon King or anything like that, but is cut off by the little monster, who says it understands his situation. After all, one had to pretend to be something until eventually becoming it. She herself had been born a beast and had tried all her life to become stronger. However, apparently, it hadn't worked out very well. So the slime consoles the protagonist, saying that it was alright because the future awaited him, which ends up leaving the monster even more frustrated. Then the slime suggests the two become best friends right away, leaving the creature outraged. But the little blob says that to celebrate their friendship, she would give him good news to cheer him up, explaining that the river in front of them was called Torab, and it was a kind of magical lake that glowed at night. So if he needed magic, maybe it could help. The slime jumps in, making everything glow. However, the king complains that it wasn't enough to recharge his magic, not even close. But it was his first day of resurrection, so he should cut himself some slack. He calls the blob and declares that she would be his first being and they should join forces. Honored, she agrees, jumping into the monster's hand, who is determined to begin a new conquest of the world. The two head through the forest, being pursued by some knights. They were monster hunters who thought they could take down the duo. His master intended to run using magical powers, but it would tire him out a lot. He shouldn't overdo it because he knew his magic at that level wouldn't last more than 1 or 2 hours. Apparently, he had hit rock bottom and was starting to accept it. When he tries to summon something to throw at the guys, it's not the most effective thing in the world. But even so, he tries to stay confident and warns the human duo that they shouldn't mess with him. Even weaker, he was still the Demon King, so they should fear him. The MC points his staff at them, casting the spell of chaos. In a hurry, the two try to defend themselves, launching a kind of enchantment toward the king that causes an explosion. When he realizes that his attack attempt fails, the guy acts like a spoiled child and complains that he had used the last bit of magic he had on that thing and now had no other option. One of the humans advances toward him with a sword, but the blob quickly hits the boy's mouth, making him nauseous. Then she takes over his body and the two fall to the ground. Even the king himself was disturbed by all that disgusting mess. However, even though watching digestion was something terrible, at least they had gotten rid of the humans. When the slime returns to her friend, the king asks if she was really going to stay stuck to him after that horrible thing. Looking around, the beast wonders if he needs to eat something to re-energize or if that was just something the blob did. She says yes, because killing just for the sake of killing was something only humans did. And she explains that since monsters hunted prey, they should eat. So the Demon King munches on the guys, still aware that it was a small amount of magic, but it was nutritious enough for now. He confesses he didn't expect his first servant to be so useful and praises her. But the slime suggests that maybe he was just really weak, which manages to irritate the protagonist, who immediately tells her to shut up because she knew nothing of his true power, and if she had seen what he was capable of before his resurrection, she would be completely terrified. After that moment of arrogance, he comments that they were doomed if things continued that way, with so many limitations. As he wonders how he could deal with this, the blob suggests he turn into a human for now. Just the suggestion makes the king laugh because now he already had flesh and bones inside him, so he could morph into a human being without any difficulty. Getting ready to transform, he warns that something grand is about to happen. In a simple explosion, the king transforms into a mustached guy with lots of hair and extravagant clothes, thinking he looks super hot. But seeing that, the slime asks if he wasn't trying to look less suspicious, because that look was way too flashy. So the Demon King explains that it was just a warm-up for what he really wanted to do. He shifts into a muscular woman full of love to give. This makes the blob question if humans really wore armor like that. But he asks back if human women didn't dress like that. The MC transforms a few more times into pixels, into a furry, and into an overly exaggerated fighter, until he ends up as a kind of weird-looking child. Tired, the slime says it was better to stick with that form anyway. They just needed to do something about those clothes because it had to be something that caused a stir. He switches to something like a giant blanket that seemed to be the right size. In addition, his partner says they should come up with a tragic story to tell others. Something about his family being eaten by monsters and all that. The two were very lucky to spot a carriage that seemed to carry rich people. Even the little monster had to admit that everything was very convenient for the situation. They should get into that carriage as soon as possible, and surprises the MC by transforming into a kind of hat on his head. The little one climbs down pretending to be crying and approaches two men, explaining that he ran away from the forest and that his parents had been eaten. He felt like the Sherlock Holmes of spies as he asked for help, and he asked the two suspicious men to take him to the nearest town. However, one of the guys moves toward him with a demonic face, determined to use the child to make even more money. So the king runs, wondering why the same kind of thing kept happening to him all the time. Apparently, it was his new appearance. Soon he quickly casts a spell to return to his normal form, and explains to the men that they had no reason to kidnap him. However, the situation backfires, because when they realize he was in fact a demon king, they thought it might be even more profitable to hunt him. Apparently, the plan was to grab the slime on his head first, capturing it with a small net, but the monster warns that he would come back to get his friend. But soon he feels a terrible pain in his bones. The human's plan was to dismantle him and then sell his bones bit by bit. He felt desperate and knew that this was truly his end. However, a power of resonance sent that thing flying away. He didn't know what had happened until he noticed another creature responsible for the attack. There was a kind of corrupted elf with green skin and a large physique. It was an orc. With the human defeated on the ground, the orc in front asks if his friends were being attacked by humans, and the protagonist asks if he had also been attacked, but he denies it, explaining that more humans have been coming to the area lately, so they should leave right away. For that reason, he decides to invite the Bag of Bones to stay in his village with him for now. The king is offended by the nickname, stating that he was the embodiment of evil and of the fire of hell, the Demon King. But the orc doesn't care and says that real demon kings usually said they would become kings, not that they were on their way to it. Doubting the boy, who gets frustrated because no one believed what he said. Then the blob says that he had been declaring himself the Demon King since his very first appearance, and that she admired him for saying it with such confidence. That makes the protagonist tell the blob to shut up. Walking through the forest, the Demon King asks if the village where the orc lived was deep inside the forest, and if only orcs lived there. He explains that he was a different type of orc. Apparently, it was something the Demon King didn't know about. According to him, green-skinned orcs were usually from highlands and lived in mountain regions. They were the kind of orc people imagine when thinking about what an orc truly was. That's why, in fact, the protagonist had recognized him as an orc and not some other monster. But those creatures with better bodies and bluish skin were violent and had another name. Those with rigid bodies were more like a separate race. In short, there were many types of different orcs, and he makes that very clear to the MC. Finally, the guys arrive at the new friend's village. As soon as he waves to his companions, he's greeted by a bunch of beasts staring at him with a smile. Our boy says that was pretty primitive for him, while the friendly orc talks to his kin and explains that this monster was someone he found in the forest, calling him Boneface, who was trying to become the Demon King, which obviously offends him, making him reaffirm that he really was the Demon King. One of them mocks him, saying the man must be really ambitious, and praises him for his determination to become a Dark King, wishing him luck on his journey. That only makes him even more stressed, but the other guys don't care, always being super sweet, telling him they would support him with whatever he needed. However, one of them asks that he not become a Demon King who didn't care about anything like the previous one, and everyone else agrees. The MC even tries to argue that he was amazing in his own way, but in the end, he had been defeated by the hero anyway, which hurts his ego. Since the old king started the war alone, all the other young demon kings turned against him and died in horrible ways. He said they had to leave the past behind. But ever since they realized the monarch wasn't strong enough to win, even his very existence became questionable. According to the monsters there, he ruled without knowing how to govern properly, until the man snaps, saying he was very smart considering they were orcs. Speaking under his breath, the protagonist says he had been a very liberal king, although he doesn't reveal his true identity to the guys who wouldn't believe him anyway. The MC yells that even if things had gone differently, he never would have imagined what was going to happen. So the boy sits alone with his slime friend, reflecting on how hard it was to be a king. He had never thought about ruling, and all he ever did was worry. So he just went straight into hand-to-hand combat. He thought that was all he needed to focus on to keep governing satisfactorily. Besides, he knew he would be recognized if he won, but cast aside if he lost. He wanted to win just for that, to get a little recognition. He wanted to win and then deny his own truth, and he was willing to do all that because as long as he was on the winning team, he had peace of mind, thinking only about victory. So he thought everything was fine. That's when he started becoming a selfish king, a feeling that only grew in him until his death. But now the way things were, he questioned what good result had ever come from that. After all, he had been defeated by the hero and now had a bunch of orcs telling him how a true king should behave. The blob asks what a king really is, but not even he knows how to describe his ideal type of government. He's soon pulled out of his thoughts when the guy who found him in the forest calls him to eat. There was a kind of weird soup, and Bone Boy gets the worst part. He swallows hard and says he didn't want any bones in his food. But the guy doesn't care and shows him the other bones they had there so he could enjoy them later. No one listened to him in the end. He takes the opportunity to offer a bit of food to the little slime, who jumps into the bowl to enjoy it. The orc asks why his new friend was so deep in thought, and the Demon King tries to come up with an excuse, saying he was just worried, thinking about how being a king wasn't a simple task. He wasn't very good with conversations of that nature, to be honest. But he asks for a moment to say that there was a good place nearby to ask for advice that required deeper reflection. If that was what he needed, he could talk to a bunch of people way smarter than him. There was a village of dark elves with whom they had had a good relationship for many years. Quickly, the king starts judging the elves, asking if he was talking about the pointy-eared creatures. The orc confirms, and the protagonist asks if the relationship between them was something really intimate or what, which clearly offends the monster. And the guy explains that's just what comes to mind when thinking about that kind of relationship. He was definitely a very prejudiced king, and the orc explains that it was something common, but definitely just a misunderstanding, explaining that the elves saw orcs as comfort monsters with chubby bodies, which makes the protagonist question whether they didn't just think of orcs as fat and ugly monsters. Ignoring that last part, he continues saying that from the orc side, they saw elves as monstrous kittens. After all, cats were super cute. However, during their mating seasons, they were completely different. They were an incredible stereotype. Finishing the explanation, the orc says that some of the young ones would be visiting the village that had teachers, and he invites him to join the trip. He even adds that 2 of them would meet the village directors of the elves, something he didn't even know existed until then. He didn't know what the orcs actually taught, but he accepted the invitation. He wanted to learn all the elves' wisdom, and this would be his second big step. After all, if he really wanted to become great, he should take advantage of the last skull that was left to feed himself properly. So the MC just followed his new orc companion and walked with the 2 boys. However, he noticed something different about them and wondered what it meant. Instead of having the chubby form of the other orcs in the village, they were almost like bodybuilder orcs. One of them explains that orcs always consumed a lot of energy, so most of them had a lot of subcutaneous fat. But they were different because they basically starved themselves to maintain that perfect body type, and they did that to become like their instructor. One day, they hoped to have the same form as him, so they would use all their power for that task, motivating the MC to meet the instructor that day to get an idea. The blob even teases her friend, saying that meeting those big guys must be special for Bone Boy, who felt overestimated. Then the king flexes his muscles to impress the little blob. That makes his arm glow, and even he is impressed, saying that if he gave it his all, he could use all of his strength to the max. He gets a sarcastic response in return. However, his moment is interrupted by a terrifying sound, making the MC ask what that was, and one of the buff guys responds that it was the instructor speaking. It was bizarre because his voice sounded like a sequence of long footsteps. It was like a very loud roar, making the king imagine the instructor was a terrifying man. He was the one who would train all those orcs in the village to their limit, so it was expected that he would be very strong, especially in martial arts. He must have been someone worthy of leading so many strong warriors. His massive foot announces his arrival quickly, and the atmosphere even heats up because of it, until they realize they are in front of a sort of lava river. The other 2 orcs ask what was wrong and if the king was already feeling that heat, because the temperature around the instructor was usually even higher, as if he had a volcano condensed in his very skin. They were trembling with fear, until the instructor appeared. He was enormous, a creature 5 times the size of normal orcs, clearly not just any orc. You could see what they meant about having a volcano condensed in his own skin. The MC was impressed, and the monster puts his hands together, making another object appear. He crouches down to give it to the protagonist, who asks what it was, but gets no answer as the big guy just turns his back and walks away. Then the instructor says that was lesson number 1. He should look carefully at its form and try to copy it. He even gives the steps, saying first he had to raise his arms like a cross. The 2 friends are impressed that the MC is receiving orders and guidance from the instructor. Without even having met him before, they decide to follow along as well. Although the protagonist was confused, the blob says he should just go with the flow and try to follow the orders, because it would be beneficial for him too, so the Demon King agrees, moving very slowly. The master tells him to hold that position for 15 seconds and pay attention to his arms, keeping his shoulders relaxed. It was funny. Even though it was a short time, he was already getting tired. But the leader is firm in asking him to breathe carefully while lowering his arms slowly, keeping his elbows extended throughout the process. He was already happy with the idea that this was the end of the training, until the orc told him to stretch his arm again. Before flexing his arm again, he should relax completely, which catches our boy by surprise. Basically, the orc was teaching him how to do a dumbbell curl. He was already feeling tired and couldn't use magic there because it would be a complete waste of time. The orc wanted him to do 12 to 15 repetitions until he reached his limit. Even the blob couldn't believe he was submitting to that situation because it felt like the weight increased with every rep. He couldn't take it anymore. It was impossible. By the 10th rep, he already felt like he was about to meet God, until the master calls his attention. The master tells him to pay attention to his posture. It was as if he were doing a stone lift, even if the dumbbell had little weight. The pain he felt was like a burn, and he couldn't lift his arms anymore. He felt very strange, and when he hit 12, he felt that was enough. So he crouched in front of the instructor, saying that was his limit. However, the orc steps toward him, surprising him. He even tries to protect himself, but all the orc does is grab the dumbbell and try to pull it from his hand. The orc praises him, saying that he didn't let go of the item even after reaching his limit, which was a sign that he had a strong heart, and now he just had to do it 3 more times, and the orc would help with everything else. He explains that when someone is near their limit, the monster that lives in their heart whispers that they're not good at it and that they can't do it. That usually sinks into the hearts of weak people, whispering all those mean and discouraging things. And that's why he trained with his friends. If he were alone, his heart could give in to all the pressure. But that changed when he was surrounded by people who liked him. He asked not to lose the monster in his heart because only that way could he handle the hardest training. And he asked him to do his best for the next 3 reps. The blob didn't know if all that was one big joke or what, but the Demon King kept going while being motivated by the instructor. He was already on the second to last, and when he lifted for the last time, he was embraced by the 2 orc boys and the mentor, who also praises him. At the end of all that, it was as if he had been launched into the air, and everyone smiled in celebration and clapped around him. In the end, he says it hadn't been that bad. Still, he couldn't believe he had managed to do all that. Now the master says it was time to do the same with the left arm, which makes him scream that it was impossible because he was too tired. Sometime later, the instructor comments that the protagonist looked like someone he used to know. That's why he used his usual greeting and apologizes because he mistook him for someone else. By this point, our boy was already trembling from so much exercise. The instructor, understanding, says the world is a very big place, so that kind of thing happens. Changing the subject, the protagonist asks what exactly the instructor was because he didn't seem to be an orc. The instructor thinks for a moment before answering. He says he is the embodiment of the ancient fire of the city, the gatekeeper of hell of the emperor of purgatory. He's had many names, but the one he likes most is Hellfire, and he'd be happy to be called that. The smaller orcs notice how low his energy was and how his ashes were slowly fading. He says his body was getting cold, so he enters the lava pool to warm himself up. The friends explain to the protagonist that the instructor dedicated everything to his muscles. When they started to activate, he couldn't even speak. He was basically a brainless musclehead. They shout that they needed to go to the Dark Elves' village right away, and that he had to be sure he was ready. They reflect a little, and the instructor says the others noticed that his IQ seemed to have dropped. Something huge for the 2 orcs, who explained that was exactly what made him the instructor there. That spirit was completely dominated by the presence of muscles. However, the protagonist wonders that if he was called Hellfire, he must have been a high-level fire spirit. And if that were the case, there would be no reason for him to be training with low-level creatures like orcs. After all, what kind of merit did they have? He couldn't understand. Until the blob speaks up, saying that a person's rank wasn't everything. Being able to lift something heavy didn't make anyone amazing, and they had that certain something that set them apart from others, like strengths and weaknesses that only existed to decide the position someone could occupy. When the man comes out of the lava river, the blob says they should raise a toast to his muscles that day, but asked her friend not to feel bad for not being on the same training level as them. The Demon King reflects as Kames ruled using only fear to their advantage. Before he can say anything else, he is interrupted by an unexpected tremor. It felt as if someone had touched or pulled him, but only he felt it. The slime suggests it was probably just the wind, but he insists it was something stronger. Either way, he just wanted to get out of there. So the group heads toward the Dark Elf village. Everyone there was super excited, including the protagonist, who was grinning from ear to ear. He didn't know why they were going so fast, and his lungs were already burning. Even the blob that accompanied him had unexpected speed and agility. He asks her to wait a bit because she didn't even seem like a slime anymore. But she asks what the protagonist even knew about slimes, which was very little. Even so, he says she didn't need to rush so much and that something felt wrong. Basically, the leader explains that he had to keep his flame burning while his muscles were still warm, and pours a bunch of irrelevant information about his own muscles onto the protagonist, summing it up as the seed of his growth. But the Demon King knew that no matter how he heard it, he would always find it very annoying. One of the orcs shouts that he finally spotted the village, and the leader wonders if the elves were okay. Meanwhile, the Demon King gets excited about how close they are. When they arrive, they are greeted by magnificent tree-built structures, and a small elf appears to welcome the 2 of them, saying she missed them and welcoming them to her village. However, it still wasn't time to move forward, and the instructor orders them to summon all their strength against a group of creatures ahead, nothing delicate like a girl. Our boy imagined that elves were magnificent and beautiful creatures, but if they could control that, they wouldn't be called dark elves. So in that atmosphere, the Demon King asks if they couldn't just leave already, and the elf says she would show them around the village. At the moment, they were below it in a sort of common space that housed the markets. The space was very bright for being underground, as she said, but the girl shows a small piece of cloth. She throws it up and turns it into a kind of lamp, asking if he hadn't noticed there were several of those floating around. And indeed, there were many lights. They used fans during summer, so they couldn't use those lamps at the same time. It was amazing because they were devices powered only by magic. They had some heaters for winter too. The protagonist is impressed by so many civilized tools because he always had the impression that elves respected the balance of nature. To which the girl responds that they weren't called dark elves for nothing. Besides, they had a creative master there. Even though the name sounded kind of silly, he was the one responsible for most of the useful things around, which impresses the protagonist, who is super aware of his own lack of strength. So he asks the girl desperately if this master can make his staff stronger, and she says she didn't know, but they could go meet him. So they do, finding a rock star-looking elf in a shop. After explaining what he wanted, the master says it was something simple. He said he even tried to be creative, but judging by the result, it was impossible. He asks where the Demon King got that thing from because he could usually tell the type of magic wood every item was made from. However, the wood from that staff could be found on Earth today, which confuses him. Then the elf explains that he hadn't done much research on older trees, but that must have come from a stardust tree or a world tree. Besides that, it had some sort of sealant on it, which makes him ask again where he got it. It was strange for the protagonist, who couldn't even remember and says he had always had it. The elf asks if he had it since he was born, which makes him reflect. Until he was suddenly knocked down by the bubble, worrying everyone there, who rushed toward him asking if he was okay or hurt. He explained that it wasn't anything serious, he just lost consciousness for a moment. The elf continued insisting that the staff seemed to be connected to his existence, and he repeated the question about whether he really didn't remember anything. The protagonist explained that he didn't know if it would be useful or not, but that staff could be used for high-level magic that exceeded his ability. He even mentioned that he escaped a desperate situation using a spell called Soul Division, but all the magic he could use now was old. Apparently, the elf could also use that ancient magic, even though he didn't really understand the details. However, he knew that there were several secrets, including the protagonist's past, that were sealed within the staff. Apparently, things were more complicated than before. Walking through the forest, a giant orc celebrated his arrival somewhere, telling a little elf that she was his favorite. Indeed, it was very beautiful to see all that scenery, and he laughed kindly. He commented on a patient alone consumed by loneliness in a dark room and wondered if he was already feeling better, as he had no idea. Meanwhile, the little elf said she was getting old and going out so much was already too much for her, which made the orc confirm that was why they had brought an entire bed along with him. That surprised her before she let out a little laugh, finding everything very strange. The girl transformed a small leaf into a bouquet of flowers, impressing the orc, who found that magic incredible. Even she seemed surprised by her own ability. He kept praising the girl, saying it was amazing to have that power to make things bloom. Delighted with her abilities, holding her flowers, she said that if that's what he wanted, she still had many magical tricks up her sleeve. Nearby, Gimlet was listening to everything while the orc continued to adore her. Apparently, his grandmother was having an incredible moment. That was when the orc lifted her bed and took her on a walk through various places. It was his grandmother, wondering how far she had really gone when she woke up. She remembered the day the orc went to war, how hard it was. But he wasn't the kind of creature who just gave up on everything. Of course, the wait was very long. And it was even a somewhat funny story about an elf who lived for thousands of years. It had already been a decade since they last saw each other on that flower day. Without him, the spring sun, summer rain, autumn flowers, and winter sky weren't as fun. It was like a gray world for the elf, who said that the moment the guy came back, he turned her world into a great rainbow once again. As in the previous days, she wanted to go back to that place her friend had taken her. He was surprised and downcast by the request, and he was ready to refuse when someone asked to do it for him. It was Gimlet, saying he was already tired of everything and would do anything, even align with lies, if that's what she wanted. So the orc agreed and went to the land of memories, carrying the woman's bed again. She was surprised by the view there. She remembered the pleasant day they had and all the smell of nature, besides the beauty of the horizon. When they arrived at the destination, he placed the woman's bed on the ground and her eyes sparkled, seeing how she was surrounded by beauty once again. Gimlet stood behind the tree, watching everything. It was like a big lie that would please someone on the verge of death. Even though everything looked normal from the outside, he knew she wasn't really there. No matter what he did, it would be very painful. She couldn't even remember her grandson's face. However, even if he was an orc, he must have been someone very important to her. The Demon King asked if that orc was a lost soul and questioned what was wrong with him. Basically, to show his grandmother's illness to a doctor, the orc volunteered for the Demon King's army to make up for something. Even so, after the army's loss, he managed to escape the battlefield. And when he was about to return to the village, they encountered a dangerous beast. According to the doctor, at least it was already too late. Even if he fulfilled his promise, now he lived in that endless dream with that random guy. And he lamented because of the war started by the Demon King, crying over everything that was happening. After that depressing situation, the protagonist left the forest. Noticing his downcast expression, the slime asked if he wasn't used to those kinds of things. But the MC replied that everyone lost something when he lost the war, and he wonders if things would have been different if he had managed to defeat the hero in the end. To which the bubble replies that there would have been losses either way. After all, it was a war, which meant there would always be casualties like that. In her view, the guy barely knew that elf. She argues that the death of monsters was inevitable, whether in territorial disputes, hunts, or encounters with heroes out there. One way or another, everyone had their story. So with or without victory, he would see this kind of thing around. And she warns that if he really wanted to become the king of monsters, he had to deal with it the best way possible. He had to understand what those creatures thought, why they lived, and even what they were willing to die for, how they lived their lives, and what effect that had on the world. All of those things were relevant for a monarch. To the slime, that was the perfect point for the future Dark Lord to start learning. Then she shapes herself into a small propeller, Taking flight, the bubble asks if he intended to help with the funeral. Instead of standing there like a wimp watching, she suggests that her friend go see the situation from another perspective, which the protagonist interprets as a way of not letting that death be in vain. After all, it was the war he himself had started, so it should be his responsibility to see old elf off. Thinking about that, the MC agrees. Sometime later, he goes to meet the instructor, who thinks that funerals were quite a lot of work, so even if they didn't want help, they wouldn't hate that it had been offered. He reveals that he understood the Demon King's motivations and was also on his way to offer help. That's why he invites him to come along. While walking, the muscled man says that the situation reminded him of when he used to send souls to a better place with someone similar to the MC. When they arrive in the village, Gimlet introduces himself, saying that the person in charge of the funeral was the daughter of the village chief, so they should speak to her. And so they do, finding a frantic elf who had just heard everything. She says she could start by distributing talismans around, which made anyone who had them more attractive. That was very important to elves, even at funerals. As soon as she gives one to one of the orcs nearby, his appearance changes completely. After that, someone had to sew runes onto some cloths they had there, which was harder than the protagonist imagined it would be. It was curious to see so many people working hard just to say goodbye to one person. No one in the village complained about having to work together, so it was a task fueled by love over the centuries. He continues doing everything he's told, watching so many strangers involved in that production, until he notices a house with lights on inside and asks why it's always lit. Then the elf explains that it was the shine shop used for cremations. In it, the relatives of the deceased would have to chant a magical glow. Since most of the fire spells were made by the ancestors, they needed to send them off with that glow. In this case, the older the fire spell, the better. Especially when it came to the fire spell of Origins, which was the progenitor of all fire around there. No one knew how to chant such an ancient spell anymore, so she says the only thing left was the legend about it. So their creative master was trying to make something similar to that fire of Origins, even though he was going through a rough patch as he only had his grandmother as inspiration. It was possible to hear him working even from outside. The protagonist stared at him, thinking about how he hadn't stepped away even though the funeral was the next day. Even the bubble was concerned about it. He decides to go in and check on Gimlet, finding the boy still sitting at the table. Apparently, he had finished making the spell, but it still wasn't enough. Sobbing, he apologizes to his grandmother. He couldn't do anything else in the end of her life. Now it was time for the funeral. They should summon the ancient vases and light the fire, place the lady's body on a small boat with lots of flowers, praying for her to go in peace. He wished all the best for his grandmother, even though he already missed her. That was when he broke down, yelling to her that he didn't know what to do when she started losing her memories, and apologizing for having neglected her. Gimlet cries, and he tried to do the best he could, thought he could cure that illness in time even without medicine. So he turned to what he had. When that didn't work, he tried other things, kept trying until the end of her life, but it was hard, because nothing worked and time kept passing. In the end, he ended up surrounded by useless tools. Meanwhile, his grandmother's time was also running out. Gimlet cries, saying he should have spent more time with the woman, neglecting his title as creative master, admitting he had been of no use in the journey. He couldn't do anything for love. That was when he noticed a small light around the canoe where his grandmother's body lay. It was like the fire of Origins. He couldn't believe it because he hadn't finished the project yet. It was impossible to recreate that. The protagonist watched how beautiful that fire was, and Gimlet ignored the Demon King, stating that he was being selfish, because he was the one who started the whole war, and yet there he was lamenting his loss. Especially since just yesterday she was still smiling, and now she was divided between spirit and flesh, and she would never be able to say anything again or look back like a useless corpse that would only live on in his memory. Even with her cold hands, she would still warm hearts around there. He found it curious how they would remain connected even after the lady's death, suggesting that this was what she meant when she mentioned bonds. Now he understood Gimlet a little. The king didn't know if he could help, but he wanted to do something for them and hoped it wasn't too late. Then in his thoughts, he wondered why he had been able to kill everyone if he knew what it meant to have bonds, and he asked the hero to teach him a little about that. After some time, the king apologizes for making someone carry so much heavy stuff. It was the instructor carrying several baskets. Even so, he said it was good training, being praised by Gimlet. He asks if the elf was well enough to go with them to sell things in other villages nearby, to which Gimlet replies that everyone had bills to pay and he couldn't keep whining forever. Besides, especially in delicate moments like that, staying in his own village would only make things worse. He changes the subject, saying the protagonist must be curious about his staff, to which the Demon King replies that he indeed wants to know the item's story. Not just that, but his erased memories made him very curious. After all, he hadn't even questioned that until then. Since they were heading to the land of the Queen of Disguise, they would probably find some useful information about the seal's function on his staff. That reminds the elf that he had something to give to the MC. According to him, it was a kind of thank you for everything he did at his beloved grandmother's funeral. So he gives him a guiding ring and a silver wand. And he explains that there was some unknown power that allowed his staff to seal itself, and since he couldn't control the wand, his friend would probably make better use of it. The MC asks what the ring was for. Gimlet says it was exactly what it looked like, a guiding ring that should stay on the staff so he could see the state of the seal. Because the power he mentioned was trying to break it and escape, which caused instability in the lock so it could break at any moment. He argues that he knew his companion would like to open it soon to learn more about his past. But he confesses to having a bad feeling about it and advises him to keep everything as it is with the help of the ring. In addition, the elf offers to keep an eye on the item, something the Demon King agrees to, stating that he would keep the gifts since he'd have to deal with the situation eventually. Then they continue on their path as usual. Far from there, a guy initiates the cleanup operation Reen's Broom, alongside the sacred group of illuminated knights of the United Kingdom, who called themselves the backbone of the operation. It was a group composed of a brat, a nerd, a hottie, a monster, and bearded guy. They had just received the minutes of an important meeting. It stated that the years since the Demon King's defeat passed quickly, and now the monsters had no power among them, so it was time to strike. Enfeed explains that if they pressure the monsters into gathering, they could ambush and eliminate them, and they would have full support from the Sacred King for that. First, they needed to form their troops and secure enough food. For that, he asked the old man to prepare an army for them. Meanwhile, Lord Vargoski would pressure several regions. Kazadoi interrupts, asking if he shouldn't be the one responsible for leading that plan. However, the nerd argues that he had forgotten his position as one of the Illuminated and went looking for trouble without authorization, and he reminds him that his only duty was to defend the territory in the king's name, wishing he would take that into account from now on. Even so, the old man grumbles, saying he already knew why he wasn't chosen as the leader, but didn't see any point in choosing the apathetic one for that role. Gilia raises her hand to say that if they were talking about Vargoski, she had to agree with Enfeed. For even if he hadn't personally finished him off, among everyone there, he was the most involved in the Demon King's defeat. And he rambles on about how he was a master with the sword, a great army commander, and with magic, he could be a genius. All this declaration disgusts Enfeet, and Gilia continues, saying that on a battlefield, Vargoski would be like a lion. Realizing she said all that out loud, she gets embarrassed. She even tries to correct herself, but the four-eyed one thanks her sarcastically for explaining the guy's nature to him. Seeing the whole scene, Kazadoi laughs and says they should move on and see how the flaming lion would perform on the battlefield. Nearby, Adu listened to everything, realizing how badly the discussion was going. The muscular guy confesses that he didn't know the Illuminated would show up, since they didn't help at all when they were trying to defeat the Demon King. And the sorceress felt discouraged as she commented on how hard it would be, since the group would have to go above and beyond to fight for glory. She just hoped they wouldn't start hunting witches after they were done with the monsters, which makes the big guy ask if that's why she created the Witches' Gathering. But the girl claims that the whole problem was the hero, and the man remembers his son, who was also a pain. He always made a point of making amazing promises and then leaving, never expected he'd say something like that, about how he felt it was wrong to eliminate the monsters that way. Somewhere in the forest, the hero walks hooded. He seemed to be looking for something, until he reached a completely clean road, certain that this world hid a secret. Back with our friends, they sit for a bit to rest in the middle of the forest. The MC asks if there would be many monsters in the village they were heading to, and Gimlet explains that not in quantity, but there was a huge variety of races there. They were waiting for Hellfire to get some water when someone shouted at them to stop. It was a group of masked guys, who apparently were the owners of that territory. The king grumbles, asking what was wrong with that group of goblins. And the bubble says they claimed that territory, but there wasn't any sign indicating it. Stressed out, the opponents charged toward the group, yelling that they could hear everything and that no one should mess with those who were keeping to themselves. The group surrounds the protagonist, saying he shouldn't underestimate them because they already knew who he was, but they are stopped by Gimlet, who asks them to calm down, explaining that they were just merchants on their way to the village of Disguise to do some business. But one of the goblins tells him to shut up, claiming they wouldn't be able to pretend to be monsters there, and still calls the group stupid for walking around near a human village, which made their disguise even more obvious. They continue threatening the guys, until they are interrupted by a shout stating that they knew nothing about the war. The Demon King asks if they thought it was wise to keep babbling while he was close enough to slice their necks into pieces, and he continues explaining that if he were a human, killing him wouldn't solve anything because he could very well have informed his companions where he went, revealing the goblin's hideout. In the middle of the confusion, the slime praises her friend, asking if he had gotten stronger or what, to which he replies that he had finally gotten used to that body, and that's why his muscle memory was coming back. Now he had improved skills beyond those of war. The creature asks if he wasn't going to go ahead and finish the guys off once and for all, offering to fight for him if necessary. But the conversation is interrupted by a third person, who comments on how shameful it was that the goblin group couldn't tell the difference between real monsters and disguised humans. The guy in the top hat apologizes for his subordinates having caused so much trouble for the Demon King, and scolds them, yelling at those idiots for not paying enough attention to anything. That presence intrigues the MC, and he quickly asks who the man was, who apologizes for being rude and forgetting to introduce himself, making a long introduction about glory and presenting himself as bell-ringing Tarak. and takes the opportunity to ask the Demon King's name. "I too walk the land of slaughter. I was broken. But one day people will call me by my name again," he declares, before introducing himself as the King of Darkness, which makes Gimlet scream, scolding his friend for making those huge and weird introductions again. And he recognizes Tarek, hurrying to ask if he remembered the cute little boy who sold him a bunch of useful trinkets. Luckily, the old man manages to remember the elf boy, who is then asked by the goblins if he was a friend of their boss, and he confirms. The boy explains that he used to travel a lot around there, so the man bought many things from him. That was enough for the group of bandits to bow at his feet, apologizing repeatedly. One of them tries to justify himself, saying he didn't know he was an acquaintance of the leader and apologizes again for being so rude. But Gimlet shrugs, stating that it was just how things were in that world. With everything resolved, Tarek apologizes once more to the group, taking the opportunity to invite them to visit if they were heading in the same direction as them, and the protagonist assures him that they would after taking care of their own business. Recalling his words, the Frankenstein-like man comments that becoming the Dark Lord was a pretty big dream. But the MC didn't think so. He was sure it was actually a small wish. The group stops in front of something massive, which even shocks Hellfire. And the old man explains that the way things were, he always had to prepare for the worst-case scenario. It was a massive fortress, where there should have been just a village, but they had to reinforce the security after the war. So the village of Disguise was now the fortress of Disguise. The MC says he'd like to walk around the place, but he needed to find the queen as soon as possible. The group is stopped by someone, who complains that Tarek brought more people with him again. There was a woman with a huge snake tail, babbling about how bringing outsiders into the village without her sister's permission was a problem. The woman explains that they had to take care of the village's security above all at that moment, and the man knew there was a whole bunch of paperwork for newcomers, but she let it slide. Tarek apologizes, but insists that the woman dropped the bureaucracy just this once. She prepares to complain again, but is interrupted when someone says that if they were guests of the old man, they shouldn't be considered strangers. A kind of talking horse arrives with the conviction that Tarek's guests were guests of the village. Our boy is clearly surprised seeing a horse riding on top of another horse, but he stays quiet as the creature continues its speech, stating that since he let them in, he should do so warmly. To him, it was all about sincerity. If the woman suspected everyone, they would become her enemies. He even wanted to keep going with the philosophical talk, but stopped himself, apologizing for talking too much. Meanwhile, the woman freaks out, wanting to know if he also wanted her to give the outsiders a tour as well. The horse agrees innocently, which makes the woman scream, saying not to underestimate her and that she'd only do it because she was ordered to. But all of them had some excuse not to go on this guided visit, either because they were there for trade or to meet the queen. The poor girl screams for them to stop talking all at once because she couldn't understand any of them that way. The slime is the first to speak, asking her to pay attention. First, she wanted a map of the village, something the woman promptly agrees to provide. Then she wanted them to be taken to meet the queen, who was her sister. Next, they wanted to know more about the fortress, and that request seemed to excite her. Apparently, she had memorized all the information about the place, so they could ask anything as they walked. The Demon King takes the opportunity to ask why only the entrance was made of stone, since the fences were made of wood. And the woman says the front was its only weak point, since on the other side there was a massive rock, and other surrounding areas were made of cliffs impossible to climb. They used nature as a defense mechanism, which allowed for a natural fortification for the citizens. Even so, the man insists the structure was too big to go unnoticed. But the woman explains that everything was hidden by her sister's class A magic with a Stardust vision spell. He asks what exactly that vision was about, and the girl is surprised he didn't know, but gets excited to chatter even more. She explains that her sister's power was surreal, to the point where she could reveal secrets held by the strongest seals in the universe. In fact, her eyes shone like blue stars whenever she chanted her spells, something she found truly extraordinary. The MC asks if she was really that proud of her sister, and the woman agrees, because even though she was super powerful, she wasn't an arrogant idiot. On the contrary, she used her magic to help everyone and didn't go around bragging. Smiling, the woman says she had the best sister in the world. It was cute, and the queen's description made our boy even more curious. After a long walk, a group arrives at the queen's quarters. Almost like her personal fortress, and Khalifa handed over some paperwork to her servant, asking them to do their best. As soon as she greets her, a smile appears on the monarch's face. She jumps toward Alicia and asks if she missed her, which wasn't really the case. The queen notices they're not alone there, turning to see what her sister was talking about. The Demon King tries to introduce himself, but he's interrupted by Khalifa, who calls him pure bones, which leaves him extremely irritated. The bubble doesn't help either, commenting that he was still obviously bunny. That kind of thing made him want his original powers and form back even more. Setting that aside, the queen asks what she could do for the boy. He explains everything briefly, since he wanted her to take a look at his staff. Before Khalifa proceeds, the MC warns that he had no idea what could be in there, so he asks her to be careful. But all she responds is that she'll be fine. With a brief flick of her fingers, the monarch releases several enchantments that seem trapped there, leaving everyone shocked. None of them had ever seen so many magic circles together before. Even the monarch questioned if all of that was real. She quickly drops the staff, worrying Alicia, and she keeps asking what that abnormal thing was and where he had gotten the item. To which the protagonist replies that he'd also like to know that and asks what exactly Khalifa had seen. The woman explains that it wasn't much, but she felt something strange, as if she were coexisting with the power of another world or even something greater, like a force far more expansive than her own. According to her, it was like dealing with the power of Emperor Millennia, and just the fact that they knew about him surprises the bubble. Khalifa reveals that she had touched a relic of the Emperor before, stating that as soon as she did, she completely forgot who she was. It was as if all of her senses had disappeared, erasing the line between what was her and what was the world, merging everything into one. Now she felt the same thing with that staff. Hearing so much information, the Demon King asks what the woman knew about this emperor, since it could be a great clue. Alicia explains that he was the first Dark Lord, finding it strange that the guy didn't know that. She continues saying that his strength was incomparable and he had a vision capable of reaching every corner of his kingdom. He was omnipresent and immortal. She didn't know if it was true or not, but she had heard that 1,000 years before the hero defeated him, the Lord dedicated his time to creating a paradise for all monsters. Emperor Millennia was the first to unite all monsters to create a kingdom. It was the beginning and end of the Dark Lords, which is why it was so strange he didn't know anything about him. Suddenly, a rock falls from the ceiling, catching the two friends' attention. Noticing this, the bubble asks if the ceiling was collapsing, which alarms everyone there. They felt tremors coming from above non-stop, and she warns that they needed to get out of there quickly because something was happening on the surface. When they came out, they found a terrible scene. Several humans seemed to have invaded the village in search of monsters. The violence was clear, and juice was spilling through every corner of the city. Even the Demon King was surprised by such brutality. One of the humans prepares to charge at him, but the MC acts quickly, chanting what little magic he had to defend himself in that emergency. All that terror leaves Khalifa desperate. She didn't even know what to say seeing all that, let alone what to do, until one of the men runs toward her, saying she should get ready to be dragged away. However, our boy jumps into the fight, preventing the worst from happening, and manages to defeat the human successfully, which puts a smile on his juice-stained face. He asks if the queen was hurt, but she ignores him and asks how the humans managed to find the fortress. And the guy suggests they had invaded through the main gate, leaving the monsters scared and confused, which only worsened the whole situation. Desperate, Alicia waves a flag while yelling for the rest of the citizens to evacuate the area quickly, surprising Khalifa, who was too lost to think of a counterattack. So she orders everyone to listen to her sister and obey, but asks the monsters who knew how to fight to grab their weapons. Suddenly, someone calls Her Majesty, worried about the woman's condition. It was Tarak, celebrating that the queen was safe, and asking her to stay behind the goblin army so nothing bad would happen. He assures her that he would take care of everything, so she should just gather everyone and escape. The woman feels relieved by the man's presence and asks what exactly had happened. Tarak explains that the humans had sent an army of soldiers to the location, with over 1,000 troops, surprising them with the numbers. Apparently, the humans had been following the monsters heading to the fortress for a while, using their mages to destroy their defensive shields. That way, they broke the main gate of the village, leaving the monsters completely exposed. To the man, there was no way things could get worse. Finally, the protagonist steps forward, stating that in that case, they should make lemonade from the sour lemon they had. Tarak is surprised that the bony guy is still there, and says that he was just a guest, so he needed to escape. The old man explains that if he ran now, he could probably get away, since he surely didn't want to pay the price of the fight. But the MC clenches his teeth, and says he could come to understand that a king didn't just fight his own battles. He had traveled to broaden his knowledge and ended up in that place for a reason. In conclusion, he states that he couldn't escape war, no matter where he was, so he felt as if he was destined for it. Tarak tries to argue, but the MC turns his back, saying he had nothing more to say. Then he asks if the goblin had any plan to win the battle, which is enough to make the man laugh, saying he was being overestimated. In that case, he suggests they change the course of things because at the moment, they were being overwhelmed by numbers. With magic, they could increase the water flow, and he reveals that some subordinates had already gone to the village reservoir. So the idea was to flood the area. However, there was still one problem. They needed to buy time. Tarak knew that although they could slow things down, they were at a disadvantage both in number of soldiers and resources. In addition, they weren't even close to the level of training the humans had. Realizing that they lacked an experienced commander, he asked if the MC had gone through something like that. And the bubble asked the same. Determined, our boy claims he had experience with that sort of thing and asks for permission to show it. And he walks toward the monsters who were left to fight with firm steps, remembering his vow to never run from a war. On the other side, the human knights screamed, ready for another attack. But this time, they would have to deal with monsters willing to wipe out their race. One of the knights charges toward the protagonist, who extends his staff and counterattack. The impact between the two is thunderous. and he yells for the monsters to defend themselves with their shields and cloaks because the enemy's spears were dangerous. The Demon King continues guiding everyone there, instructing them not to confront directly, reminding them that they were just trying to buy time. So they shouldn't finish them off yet, just distract the humans present. Tarak was more serious than ever when he said that any humans who didn't fear their master should come at them with everything. His speech leaves all of them stunned because now the monsters were acting differently. They were completely lost now that the situation had changed. Meanwhile, the Demon King kept his past in mind during the fight. He knew he had fought too many battles, and that situation was nothing compared to what he had faced in the past. He advances on the opponents without mercy, with the help of all the monsters who were there. However, he was worried about their safety, since he hoped to hold the defensive position longer. But he felt he was reaching his limit. With every minute that passed, more human reinforcements came through the fortress gate, so it was inevitable that their front line would collapse. He is surprised by a massive explosion while trying to fight one of the knights. An old man, practically, who's finished off by the bubble before the worst could happen. The MC praises his partner, who asks if he really thought things would end in favor of the monsters because she had a terrible feeling. And the Demon King confesses that there was no way to avoid their defeat because their enemies had every advantage. In fact, he was even surprised they were still holding out. The creature asks if they can really hold on any longer, considering the thousands of things that could go wrong. The guy lets out a long sigh. Before saying they just had to make things work, then he asked a favor from the slime. Meanwhile, Tarak continues relentlessly until one of his subordinates calls him to inform that the backup equipment had been completely destroyed, which indicated that the humans had already figured out the whole plan. The chief orders the trolls to go deal with the situation with their strength, but he is interrupted by the protagonist, who warns that it wouldn't work. After all, they were already busy, holding the main gate to prevent more human troops from entering. In fact, it was thanks to the trolls that they could buy more time. Tarak argues that even though they could buy time if they didn't open the reservoir, they were screwed. And the MC says he had been through something similar before, with his opponents boiling for their heads. They had found all the traps he had set, and everything that could go wrong did. No matter how hard he tried, nothing worked. However, this time he wouldn't let that happen again. Now he would show that there was no sun that wouldn't set before his power. The bubble heads toward Hellfire to tell him what was happening, and the guy replies that he could handle it with just one hand. In that case, it was time to return to the battlefield. So they do, getting between the humans and the other monster fighters. The knights ask what was going on, and noticing the monsters were retreating, they celebrate. One of their leaders orders them to finish off those beasts because it was time to end it all. After all, the gate was opening again, so victory was certain. He raises his sword, shouting for the others to wipe out that race. Everyone runs toward the protagonist, who had served as a kind of bait for the army, which clearly worked since the humans were shouting to follow the monsters. As they ran, they called out the coordinates they should follow to find them. But when turning a corner, they're surprised by the sight. A huge jet of water crashes down on the knights like a giant wave. The beast's plan had apparently worked and swept everyone through the water. Even trying to flee, it was impossible to escape that wave. Even our guide tried to take shelter on the roof of one of the houses. Observing the scene, he concludes that that should be enough, at least for the moment. But a scream draws his attention, and he sees someone being carried away by the current. Alicia and Aliclimax scream at each other, apologizing and telling each other to hold on. Realizing who it was, the Demon King yells. Even the goblins notice, commenting that Alicia was trying to save a child who couldn't run, but ended up getting caught with the queen in the wave. Then the protagonist casts one of his spells to try to reverse the situation. They were like several giant ropes that reached toward the girls, and he asked them to hold on. The guy uses all his magic to save the two girls. However, the force is so great that it breaks the wooden roof he was standing on. This makes his companion scream for his life. Sometime later, the Demon King wakes up inside what seems to be a cell. He is already awakened by someone shouting to give back something very important to them. It was Khalifa arguing with a human over the accessory she wore on her waist, saying it would now be a gift to the human kingdom. He slaps the girl's face, calling her unbearable. Even with the pain from the smack on her face, she doesn't show weakness. The guy is indifferent, saying she should have handed over the item from the start and should be grateful to Lord Vargas just for being allowed to live, adding that if it weren't for him, she'd already be dead, yet the girl insists that he give her a dormant back. Hearing the conversation, the protagonist asks if that message meant he wouldn't be killed either, and the girl is surprised he's awake. He tries to ignore the nickname Boney he was given and tries to understand what exactly happened after they were swept away by the current. With her head down, the girl says they were locked up there apparently, since she was already in the cage when she woke up. Diana tries to stretch a bit more, accidentally bumping her head as she mentions hoping Alicia is safe. Noticing the girl's movement, the bony guy asks what she thought she was doing since they were locked up in that small cage. The girl laughs, saying it was kind of embarrassing to hear the guy's voice coming from a directory. Realizing the girl was very disoriented, he suggests she might be blind. And Khalifa explains that it was more or less that, commenting on how the magic she had was something unique. So unique that it weakened her 5 senses because it was magic that affected her entire body, especially her vision, which she lost as soon as she was born. So the crown she wore was like a magical item to compensate for this loss, and now it was in human hands. The girl explains that her upset wasn't just about them taking the crown. In reality to her, it was a very precious item. Not for its value, but because it was proof of her bond with her sister. The queen said she couldn't see well and had strange powers, so she thought nothing would change if she left the house, which is why she stayed locked in her room all day. But it was all because of her that Alicia studied so much. And that's how she learned to make a magical prosthesis, and for the first time that day, she was able to see the beauty of the world, especially the colors that flowed through her body in a memorable way. After that, she managed to feel happy and change as a person. Diana Anna adds, saying that little by little she was able to be kind to everyone and even made some friends, all because of her sister. So all of her memories were only in her head because of that crown. She didn't see it, just as a prosthesis. And she remembered how her sister made each jewel present there, decorating it more and more with each birthday that passed. She was nearly breaking down, remembering how everyone said it was something very beautiful. Noticing that the situation was getting difficult, the Demon King wondered what to say because he couldn't think of anything. At least nothing beyond war. He was completely useless in these more sensitive aspects, until the bubble gives him a nudge saying that this was the part of the conversation where he was supposed to say he would get the crown back for the girl. Then he gets startled by the presence of his friend, asking how long he had been there. But the slime calls him an idiot and tells him to shut up, hiding again in the Demon King's fur. At that moment, the humans outside yell for the monsters to shut up. Speaking more quietly, the protagonist asks when and how the little creature had hidden there, and she explains that she was actually forcibly hidden, saying it was a traumatic experience, and that she saw her companion being carried away by the water. So she tried to surf on a board that was nearby and passed through the waves, praying for her friend to survive. After a while, she managed to find him unconscious, and even helped him spit out the water and thought everything would be fine. But the humans who attacked the fort reappeared quickly, and there was no way to escape. So she hid in the guy's scarf to avoid being seen. The protagonist praises her and asks if she could get the keys to that cage, something that was easy for the bubble. He tells the queen they needed to hold a strategy meeting, and she asks what was happening since she couldn't see anything. Something the guy had forgotten, and he apologizes for it, walking toward her. He explains that the bubble was in that cage with them and could transform into a key, and the slime takes the opportunity to brag that they could escape whenever they wanted, giving thanks that it was getting dark, which indicated the perfect time for a getaway. Meanwhile, in the human's possession, the girl's crown was sitting on a bench. One of the men laughed, remembering the look on Khalifa's face, and apparently he had reached Alicia, eager to start his work. They had already come up with the perfect plan, except for one small detail. They had no idea what the escape route would be. The slime said it was such a big problem that it was almost comical, while the protagonist grumbled since obviously they didn't have a map, and it seemed the human occupation wasn't very organized. Just looking at the tents from afar, they seemed well structured, but were simply stakes with fabric over them. The tents appeared to be made of materials that could be easily transported, which made the protagonist believe they had built more temporary tents to turn that place into their base of operations. Originally, after the initial mission, they were supposed to pack up and leave, but since they kept building, the paths became meaningless. It was a kind of bizarre way to form a base of operations, and even if that person was there, it seemed everything had been built just to show off their rank, because clearly it wasn't a base built to withstand monster attacks. The protagonist trembled as he said they were trying to present it as if the base were strong, robust, full of materials. All that speech confused the bubble, and she asked what exactly her friend was trying to say. Realizing he was deep in thought, he apologized and said he was just trying to say the architecture of the place didn't make sense. Continuing, the MC explained that even if he tried to find the way out, he didn't know if it would be an easy task, and it was very dangerous to go around searching. And he concluded that they didn't have enough information to escape from there, because if what he said earlier was really true, they could take the high-ranking person as a hostage, but that would be a very difficult task. With shining eyes, Khalifa recaps, asking if he was saying that they only needed to understand the architecture of the base to escape, because she could do that without a problem, which leaves the guy confused. The woman asks if the slime could unlock her disguise bracelet so she could begin her work. Quickly, the slime transforms into a kind of key, doing exactly what the girl commanded. She stretches out on the ground as if feeling the earth. Then she uses a search enchantment, capable of mapping all the buildings and the layout of the place. Quickly, the girl stands up, stating she got everything she needed, and the short time she used impresses the Demon King. He's left speechless by the fact that she didn't need a magic circle for that. But it all seemed very ordinary to Khalifa, who rambled about finding a kind of treasure with valuable things where she believed her crown and the protagonist's staff were. And that only surprises the guy even more. However, this only implied that they didn't need to leave empty-handed, something the girl agrees with because she wanted her crown back. She draws a small layout map on the sandy floor and asks if it was enough to make a kind of escape plan. Observing carefully the bag of bones, says it was even more than they needed. Then he explains that the queen should stay in the middle due to her impaired vision, while he would go in front and the slime behind to keep watch. And he had noticed that there were a few open paths around. Understanding everything, the bubble asks if they needed to be fast because she could help with that. Suddenly, she sprouts two massive legs beneath herself, activating speed mode, which slightly disgusts the protagonist. Ignoring her friend's reaction, the bubble asks where they should go to get the staff and the crown. According to the map, the building Alda Khalifa referred to is near the entrance to the area, so as soon as they got out, they had to get there as quickly as possible. Either way, they had to be fast to retrieve their belongings because they would be unarmed until then. The protagonist also warns that if they were caught, there would be nothing they could do. As the bubble unlocked them from there, she asked if the two friends were ready. Then fearlessly, they departed. It was finally time to escape. They ran and the Demon King called for them to keep going faster. Of course, they didn't want to get caught, so they had to flee through the shadows. Suddenly, the MC yells for them to stop. They had reached a corner, and someone needed to scout the area. He forces his third eye to pop out of his skull and run off. The little lobe observes what's beyond that corner while the king states that it's his secret weapon. Then he activates escort mode with maximum magical power and a great explosion, which results in a muscular creature called I-Man. With the appearance of that creature, the bubble asks if they really needed that because she thought her services were enough, but is cut off by the protagonist. They watch the hybrid while hiding as he sees the bright light of the torches. Suddenly, the monster starts running, beginning his escort. He goes to the end of the alley where the group needed to go. Then he signals for the group to approach cautiously. The three hurry until the Demon King says he found something. Surprisingly, the third eye could speak and startles the bubble by asking if that wasn't the treasure. It was strange because it had a surprisingly high-pitched voice. The protagonist thanks him while the eye returns to its original place. Indeed, they were in front of the place that held their treasures, and the absence of guards suggested it was during a shift change. Either way, our guy advances because it was the perfect moment to go after his staff, while the queen gets ready to search for her crown. Since the bubble wasn't after anything specific, she says she can help. However, Alda Khalifa warns that they need to stay alert and grab their belongings as quickly as possible. Already at the entrance, the protagonist urges them to hurry again. Once inside, they rummage through everything they could, and they comment that there was much more inside the building than they expected. From enchanted bracelets to dark elf ornaments, over necklaces, and even rings of happiness. Looking at the pile of boxes, the slime wonders how much exactly the humans had stolen, and Alda Khalifa found it repulsive, the amount of items in each crate she opened. It was clear from the quantity of items that they hadn't just wiped out a few thousand people. The Demon King stared at the scene in silence. He remembered when he used to be hypnotized by treasure mountains in his past life, but now he realized that it was actually a mountain of corpses. He snaps out of his thoughts when the bubble calls his attention. He had his staff with him and the wand he received from the creative elf. He celebrates finding them, and Alda Khalifa takes the opportunity to ask if her crown was also there. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. The little creature suggests that it wasn't in that room, which leaves the queen outraged because she couldn't look through everything. In that case, the slime asks if the woman couldn't use her search ability again, but the MC explains that the room had a magical barrier that could lead to them being discovered. After all, her magic left a unique trace that was easy to monitor. It would be much simpler if they could use their powers there. But he asks her not to be discouraged because even without that ability, they could still find some clues. He says it was possible to use the magical barrier to their advantage. Although difficult, it wasn't impossible. The protagonist explains they could try to find the strongest point of the barrier. Because if there was a room they really wanted to hide, it meant there was something very valuable inside, though it might also be protecting other things. Hopeful, Alda Khalifa said she was willing to try, with the justification that this could give them some information and they didn't have much time left. So she closes her eyes to concentrate and use her ability. And it doesn't take long for her to find the strongest point. She points to the barrier between one room and another, saying it was as if a fog covered that area. Pulling the fabric aside, the Demon King suggests that it might be the cause because he could feel some different spells there to mask the smell and sound coming from inside. Diana quickly calls the team, but the guy asks her to calm down a bit. He wondered what exactly that barrier was, as it had a very strong scent that made him even more uneasy. The feeling only grew within her as she claimed she could feel a power similar to her own, while the guy wondered if she didn't realize it could be a trap. The bubble finds a piece of something suspicious on the ground but can't even be heard because the queen screamed that she found what she was looking for. Then the guy goes through the curtain, saying they had completed one of their goals. Diana grabs the crown, repeating several times how grateful she was for it. Then she puts it back on her head, regaining her vision, which makes her eyes shine while her two friends just stand there. She takes the chance to share that now that she could see again, she could trace a few things that were impossible to locate without the item. And the first thing that comes to the protagonist's mind is Alda Khalifa's sister. The mention of Alicia makes the girl nostalgic, and she promises out loud that she would find her as soon as possible. The king says that even if he wanted to stop her, he couldn't, because it would be much harder to escape if she caused a big scene over the situation. That's why he offers to go look for her sister with her, making the queen very grateful. She promises it would be quick and immediately invokes her ability. However, something seems to make her curious, and the bubble, noticing this, asks what was wrong. The girl exclaims that luckily her sisters seemed to be in that very building. In fact, she thought Alicia might be in the next room. In that case, the king urges her to hurry, since there wasn't much time left. As they moved along, Khalifa commented on how happy she was to have found her sister so quickly. After all, she had been worried about what the humans might have done to her. When she reaches the doorknob, she says she can finally act like an older sister to Alicia. As they go through the door, they're struck by a huge darkness along with an unpleasant smell. Something seems to fall to the ground, catching the Demon King's attention. It was a bracelet that looked very familiar. When he raises his head, he chokes on the sight before him, and Khalifa prepares to light up the place as she couldn't see anything even with the crown. The guy shouts for her not to do it, but it's too late, and the queen sees her sister in a deplorable state. They didn't even know what to say. They just kept repeating the same questions about what that could be. With all of her memories of her sister smiling in her mind, Khalifa didn't want to believe any of it was happening, screaming that it was fake. She gathered the shards of Alicia's tail in despair, saying that she needed to put everything back together, and she had to preserve her pride and her beauty. Seeing that with sadness, the protagonist asks the girl to stop, but she doesn't care, stating that her sister couldn't have passed on, and she would fix everything with her magic. However, her sister's pieces crumble in her hands, leaving her devastated. With sorrow, the king says she was too hurt, and they must have torn her from the girl by force. Picking up some of the pieces from the floor, he concludes that everything was charred by something not even a hot iron could do. He thought that all that torture was very difficult to carry out, so it must have been a long process. Judging by how things were there, she must have been tortured non-stop the entire day. His words strike the queen like a spear to the chest, and she remembered all the times her sister lifted her up during her candidacy. With tears in her eyes, she says she would never forgive that. But all of her sadness turns into hatred as she makes the entire building tremble. The woman is able to cause a massive explosion that throws a large part of the building into the air, and she keeps screaming that she would end the life of every human responsible for that. After the huge explosion, the Demon King shouts for his friend to calm down because she couldn't keep doing that in a human military base. They needed to prioritize their escape while there was still time, but for that, she had to calm her nerves. The hatred doesn't leave Khalifa's face. She completely ignores her friend and continues destroying things, throwing him away. It was as if there were no trace of the queen left inside her. Thrown to the ground, the protagonist explains that he couldn't fight against her, and the bubble notes they were in a terrible situation, because the woman was lost in her rage, and because of that, her magic was out of control to the point it would destroy her own body. She would probably die if she kept going. Grabbing his staff, the king says that if he could, he would have avoided what he was about to do, but now he had no other choice. Then he invokes the sacrificial spell of the ancient gods, which freezes the woman. It was as if her form were being drained, which would help to calm her down. Realizing that the staff was absorbing all of the queen's uncontrolled magic, the slime asks if the guy could handle such a load, because the tracking ring he had was already glowing. But the protagonist says he couldn't worry about that now, because calming the queen was more important than respecting that unknown sacred seal. It was bizarre because the power just kept expanding, and he didn't know how the woman acted so calmly while holding so much magic inside herself. The protagonist knew he had to end it quickly because if he lost even one more second, they might not make it out alive. Holding the lock, it was as if he was asking the item to hurry, even though that wasn't possible. The queen was still screaming, still fleeing from pain and grief. He argued with Khalifa that she needed to keep living her life because everyone in the fort needed her magic, her leadership, and her command. And above all those people, Alicia, her sister, wouldn't want her to die there either. The last sentence seems to be enough for Khalifa to stop screaming and collapse to the ground. Quickly, the protagonist catches her and reaffirms that expressing her anger didn't make her an evil person, but she would have time to do that soon. Breaking the moment, the bubble warns that there were several humans heading their way and they had to run immediately. King asks her to go with the queen, but from behind, leaving the slime confused about what her friend was planning to do. Then, staying behind with the staff, he says he would remain in that place. Apparently, he was using a teleportation spell, and the bubble tries to explain that the guy could still come with them. But the king says he needed to create a distraction for the humans because he wouldn't be able to carry his friends far from there. Besides, the queen still left a magical trail regardless. Now that he had absorbed all her magical power, every time he used magic, he would also leave a trace, which would put the lives of the others in danger. Hearing the explanation, the bubble asks if that was already the master's initial plan. He says he only planned to do it if it became necessary, and reminds her what he had already said before, about how everyone had different talents to find their place in the world. The Demon King says that now he had found his. The little creature even tries to argue, but it's already too late when her friend invokes teleportation. That whole adventure served to teach the protagonist a valuable lesson. In his past life, he knew nothing and did nothing useful, always dedicating himself to ending the lives of others. And that wasn't what a king should do. He continues causing various explosions there, driving all the humans out of their tents and making them wonder if they were facing an earthquake. They knew something was wrong and that the monsters were furious, so they had to prepare for war. They hear firm footsteps that made the ground tremble, and the protagonist remembered the power he once used for his own benefit, but now would use it for his companions, transforming into a huge beast. He tells everyone there to stay quiet, and declares that he was hatred, rage, and terror, the unity of the demon kings of the end times. At that moment, he truly was the Dark Lord of Agnian. The monster commands those useless pawns to carve their tombstones in despair. In one of the tents, a man who seemed to be a captain stands up, asking what all that noise was, since he couldn't even sleep because of it. Grumbling, he puts on his armor, ready to add another monster item to his collection. In fact, the bubble hadn't gone very far along with the queen. They were outside the fort, and she was outraged by the fact that her friend had made so many decisions alone. Besides, what was all that nonsense about "I found my place"? He should stop acting like he was so cool, because deep down, he was just an idiot. Back inside the fence, the monster was wiping out all those fallen humans as if it was nothing. He looked at all those bodies with contempt. More troops appeared little by little, convinced they would defeat that monster, who saw them only as fools and asked them to become aware of their own arrogance. And with a simple snap of his fingers, he was able to disfigure all of them, making them bow before him. The protagonist makes a point to call them useless soldiers. However, he constantly felt that that body, built only with his magic, used too much power just to remain standing. In that case, he had to be careful with his enchantments or he would be left with nothing. And he wondered whether he would be eliminated or run out of magic first, but he knew either way he had to hurry. He pulls out some of the stakes protecting the fort with his own hands, using them to strike several soldiers at once. He cast spells like Chaos, which were very effective there. It was as if several spikes were sprouting from the ground, and one of them hit a soldier directly. Not just one, all who crossed his path. They were done for and had an expression of despair on their faces, but their commander ordered them not to retreat and to keep advancing, because that monster was only a shell. Realizing he was different from the other soldiers, the Demon King confirms that that man was the general of the base they were attacking. Raid Vargoski said the monster did what it wanted while he slept, but now should prepare to be tortured and turned into a rug. He prepares his weapon, pulling his spear into the air, and then throws it toward the monster, as if chanting a flaming blade spell. But the monster manages to deflect it before the guy even finishes his throw, sending him flying into a nearby building. Even so, the man isn't shaken, saying this would be interesting. Again, he spins his spear with the same previous fire magic, this time calling upon the storm of flames. But again, he has no success, and the explosion is completely useless. The protagonist asks if he really thought that would be enough to defeat him, and makes the man eat dust. However, the man is persistent and suggests he was running low on power. Watching him, the protagonist asks if he was trying to flee or what. Then the man turns in a fit of rage, determined to blow everything up, but ends up cornered by the Demon King, who says that attack wasn't enough to blind him. He knew the guy didn't believe those provocations would defeat him, so he asks what card he had up his sleeve. Hearing that, the man smiles, shouting that now they had him. Several gleaming lights surround our guy, and a magic circle forms beneath his feet. Now he couldn't move anymore. That's when he realized the man must have drawn a magic circle with his spear. Even so, he didn't know what Vargoski's plan was, because with a spell on that scale, the entire base would explode. It looked like he was ready to sacrifice himself. With the spear stuck in the ground, the man concentrates, apologizing for such a grim request. He states that he was a servant of the flames and of his ancestors, but he begged while chanting until his voice died and his soul left his body. And even then, he would keep lamenting his wish, asking to be heard and forgiven. But he wanted the rain of fire to annihilate the enemy while he sang. At last, he calls upon the flames of Agashandra, causing a stratospheric explosion, which indeed damages the Demon King, but he manages to say that he was a very good opponent. However, the human continues pouring all of his power into that final breath, declaring it would be the end of the line for the creature. The protagonist only thinks about how the circle was meant to limit the range of his attack. It was surprising to realize there were other humans as strong as the hero. That attack had pushed him to the limit, but he couldn't let everything end there. And with a shout, he refuses death, surprising his opponent by leaving a large part of that body behind. He leaps, transforming into a completely different creature even bigger than before, and declares to the enemy that he would not die now, because he couldn't allow it. Face to face with that thing, the human barely knew how to react. He used his shield to protect himself from as much of the impact as possible. Now he was aware that he had underestimated his opponent's strength. He thought he could contain the destruction of that beast by finishing it off with a fire attack. But nothing worked, because the Demon King was changing form and anticipating his plans, which only made him even more furious. He calls one of his soldiers, who presents himself at his command, and explains they had to drive that monster out of the base, coordinating for units 1 through 3 to take the front while the others would prepare an ambush. Those remaining could start putting out the fire since he had gone overboard. The commanding soldier prepares to continue, planting one of his blades into the ground. Apparently, it was now time to use other strategies. Vargoski uses his techniques to fly toward the monster at the top. He was gaining confidence when he realized he had entered the magic circle, which propelled him even higher. And this enchantment makes the protagonist wonder why the guy used such a large spell to do something so small. He kept running, asserting that the human wouldn't catch up to him because he wasn't fast enough. He dug his claws into the ground, causing a great explosion there. The protagonist was surprised by the group of soldiers who insisted he wouldn't pass through that barrier of men. Even though they were just military, taking out so many people wasn't something fun for the protagonist. But as he tries to avoid the worst, he's surprised by Vargoski, who tries to strike him with his blade, and shouts that the monster wouldn't get away. When he tries to run, he comes face to face with a massive unexpected scale, which was being held by a group of soldiers ready for the ambush. The three throw their spears at the beast, piercing its flesh, making the creature scream. However, they end up becoming targets of their own spell as the Demon King tells the group not to celebrate too soon. Once again, the beast is surprised by Vargoski, who charges forward with his sharp spear toward the beast. One of his soldiers even manages to hit it directly, but it seems to have no effect at all. Now their commander's eyes burn with fury as he finally landed a hit on the creature's tail, which left some soldiers confused about what was happening. Then Vargoski is thrown far away as if he were nothing once again, and the protagonist runs, now angry. He truly was a stronger human than expected, which was a pain. Moreover, he knew how to command and attack effectively with the help of his army. He managed to turn his useful soldiers into elite fighters, and since they were on his turf, the human would always have the advantage. That's why he needed to escape the base quickly. With a pause in the fight, Vargoski comments to his soldier that he knew the monster would flee, but he would pursue him while the others put out the fire. His subordinate was aware that putting out all that fire wouldn't be an easy task. Even so, he passes the orders to the others, being contested because there was no meat. According to one of the soldiers, the wood had caused most of the flames to die out before even reaching the water. It had burned at first, but somehow the fire didn't spread. Everything seemed fine outside the fort when one of the walls exploded. It was the protagonist escaping from Vargoski again, while the man screamed like a Neanderthal. He tried to hit him with his spear at all costs, but the Demon King was skilled enough not to suffer from those attacks. When he finally manages to stab his spear into the monster, he takes the opportunity to land 2 blows. He was already starting to falter and fell to the ground with that blade. He knew the body he had constructed using only his magic wouldn't last much longer, and he was also aware that if he ran, he'd be struck from behind, but he couldn't hold on much longer. Even so, he was determined to keep fighting. All he needed to do was stay focused, because he couldn't fail now. Now was a decisive moment in the battle between the two, and he used every trick possible to defend himself from Vargoski's spear, calling out multiple times, provoking the beast, and even managing to throw it far away several times. Despite this, the Demon King focuses his mind, knowing his end could not come there, even lying on the ground, serving as a target for that human. It was then that with a precise strike, he managed to send the monster's body flying through the air, leaving only a trace on the ground. Vargoski laughed victoriously, saying that was the end. However, something caught his attention. That body, which should have been dead, was now moving. His jaw dropped upon hearing the Demon King say he was too presumptuous. And in his original form, he clearly stated that the fight had only just begun. The man burst out laughing at his opponent's transformation, mocking it because that enormous thing had turned into something ridiculous. It looked like a joke. He kept rambling, saying he had worried for nothing because the demon was all bare. The day had been full of surprises. First, that tragic snake, and now he had to face a clown skeleton. The mention of the snake made the protagonist question if he was referring to Lamia's daughter. This alerted the man, who asked if the protagonist knew her and called her a monster. Laughing, Vargoski affirmed that they had captured her near the fortress and that he had a lot of fun with her, especially when he started torturing her for information. Alicia bit her own tongue. For the man, it was very entertaining to crush her hope. First, he cut off her tail and then removed her scales little by little, which made her scream and foam. He even said that when he got tired of torturing the girl, he decided to give her a gift, a crown of Al-Khalifa. In the end, she was jumping and screaming for her sister. Closing the subject, he asked what the clown skeleton had for him, and the protagonist caused a great explosion with his staff. Calling himself a comrade of fire, he reaffirmed that he was no clown, assuring that all that spectacle between life and death should end, for there was no audience there. And summoning all his power, he declared that the human would also have to dance to his tune. Even with the threat, Vargoski asked what the Demon King's big plan was, because if that was all that remained, he wouldn't be able to burn him. He knew what the king was trying to do, stalling for time. Also that the queen could escape like a mere pawn. Vargoski looked at him with a psychopath's face, saying he wouldn't let him off so easily and would grind his bones into dust. In the end, he would celebrate everything with a banquet, and the Demon King's skull would be the best table ornament. However, the king does not back down, and drawing his blade, he says Vargoski's arrogance would be the cause of his death. The two resumed battle, striking each other relentlessly. His opponent truly had great strength, perhaps more than he had imagined. And Vargoski kept questioning what was wrong, demanding he dance like the girl who had been his prisoner. He underestimated the human's power, for now he could barely remain within the magic circle. Of course, he had no intention of fighting a fair battle, so he wouldn't lose that day, and he shouted, invoking his chaos spell. In none of the attacks did Vargoski manage to break off a piece of the Demon King's horn, which fell to the ground, leaving him completely lost. This was enough for him to lower his guard, allowing the enemy to strike him and bring him down. Lying there, he grumbled and even considered retaliating. Approaching his opponent, the man said that apparently there would be no fun with such a pathetic adversary. Realizing the guard had dropped, he picked up the fallen horn fragment and charged, knowing it was now or never. Unfortunately, Vargoski fell into his trap. He had noticed a blind spot where the shield was raised, creating enough of an opening to strike with the blade, especially at his neck. But when he tried to make that move, he was stopped by the human's hands, who said his tactics were very weak, and asked if he really thought he could marry him that way, taking the opportunity to call him an idiot. But he was surprised when the Demon King dodged and said that wasn't his plan, not even close. And with a piece of his horn, he struck the man from behind. He couldn't believe he had used his own bones as weapons, but he was quick to remove it from his back and explain that such a thing wouldn't work on him, to his sadness, telling the Demon King to stop being so lazy, because he came from dust and to dust he would return. The two resumed their relentless clash, which left wounds on both sides. The man managed to knock the Demon King down in the middle of the circle. However, the protagonist kept trying to fight back, filled with hatred in his eyes, until he uses his wand to make one more attack. But he's quickly struck by the opponent, howling in pain with the spear in his hand. When he falls to the ground again, the man questions whether he has understood by now that the two of them were on completely different levels. After all, the Demon King was losing in strength, tactics, and skill. Vargoski states that now it was over for that dumb clown. However, the protagonist tells him to shut up, saying he would never accept that defeat, and invokes the original fire to generate a flame capable of consuming everything, which makes the soldier even more outraged, questioning whether he wasn't listening, that nothing would work, and throwing the spell upward. When he stops to think a bit about the type of magic being used, he finally believes he understands what's happening. Vargoski prepares to attack the Demon King once again, while our boy drives his staff into the ground with all the strength he had left, then lets out a monstrous roar that sends everything around flying. The magic was so powerful that even his staff began to smoke, but he persists, shouting louder and louder, and raises the staff victoriously, stating that the human's flames also didn't affect him. But Vargoski mocks, saying that apparently the enemy could still defend himself a little, and carrying all the flames on his back, asks what he intended to do with that. The Demon King is surprised by that scene, stunned that he could make the guy succumb, and once again drives his staff into the ground, but this time even explodes what the guy was carrying, and ends up falling to the ground with such power, sending everything flying into the air. In the end, Vargoski remains standing, laughing and saying it was over, asking if that was all the clown had to show. Getting up with difficulty, the Demon King doesn't give up, and states they had only completed the first stage and now it was time for round 2. The skull and horns of the protagonist were gradually breaking apart, but even so, he holds his posture firmly, saying that now it was time for the human to dance, which makes Vargoski curious. He was already tired of those studied bluffs and tells the guy to give up already, because he would cut him down and throw him away right there. The soldier charges at him, shouting for him to succumb. But the Demon King draws his wand and repeats the harsh words that he would lose in strength and tactics, and pointing it right near Vargoski's face, states that he would lose in skill too, casting his spell directly at the man, who tries to retaliate without any success. Mocking, the protagonist asks what was wrong, and if he could move. After all, according to Vargoski, they were on completely different levels, right? The expression on the human's face was pure terror when the king chants the original fire, to use it as a vehicle and blow everything up, then plants his staff into the ground once more. Only now he manages to make the explosion hit the man. Even so, Vargoski coughs and stands, saying he had let his guard down. But he prepares to launch his blade, stating that the same happened to the protagonist and he should be ready for what was coming. Then he launches a sort of flame in the direction of the Demon King, who seems truly surprised by it. However, he manages to deflect the magic, protecting himself, which leaves the man very confused. Upon realizing he is still standing there intact, our boy asks if the fact that he was unharmed surprised Vargoski. Indeed, it made no sense because he had protected himself only with a wall of fire, but that alone shouldn't be enough to defend against the Aes Nil. So the king argues that if he looked closely at that so-called wall of fire, he would have noticed something different. Its essence contained the original fire that resided within the Demon King. The excess fire he absorbed from the very attacks the human made. First, what had spread across his base was mixed with his own fire, fused and enhanced so he could control it. In the end, he absorbed everything into himself, and now commanded that inferno, making everything around him blaze. Continuing his speech, he said he wasn't surprised, but it was strange that the opponent was having trouble with just one fireball while appearing invincible now. Vargoski states that fusing flames was not something he considered magic. It was much greater than anything that had existed, but there was no chance he would give up that fight. So he runs toward the protagonist, saying that someone like him should understand what he was saying in that moment. Striking his staff on the ground, our boy asks if that whole speech was the result of the pride of the enlightened, and swinging it in the air says to do as he pleases. This time, he manages to summon a flame far more thunderous than all the others beyond any comparison. so thunderous that it makes Vargoski scream. Still, he insists on keeping his posture, saying he was an enlightened one and no matter how incredible a monster was, he would never be able to defeat him. He roars that he would not die because he refused to. The flames consume the battlefield between the two, quickly transforming into a massive whirlwind around Vargoski. Hearing his screams, the Demon King questions what he was trying to say and explains that the air carrying that miserable body came from the Queen's fury, so he should enjoy it. The man burned, screaming incessantly, repeating that if one human died, he would destroy all monsters. If 1,000 died, he would destroy the 1,000, because he was the fearless lion Vargoski and would never back down. He declared that the Demon King was finished once he made it out of there. His body was almost entirely charred when the flames ceased. Even so, Vargoski remained standing like a statue of what once was. That was the end of it. I laughed and fell to my knees after all that. I was exhausted and couldn't even move a finger. However, the charred man takes a step, surprising the king, who calls him a bastard. Vargoski declares with hatred that he wouldn't burn like the others, ready to strike his opponent. He brings his blade close to the bony face. He was ready to attack, but the sword disintegrates in the air. The moment had come when he would become nothing but a handful of ashes, because he let his guard down and now was covered in shame. No matter how much he had fought, he would leave no mark on the world. Even so, Vargoski laughs, saying he had been just a toy, yet he thought he had done what he needed to, and still questions the Demon King if he could defeat 5 more enlightened ones like him because one victory alone was easy. Now that he was truly finished, the others from his group would find him somehow, including the one who struck the most fear into the protagonist. The hero was waiting. Then Vargoski tells the guy to be proud of his victory and fight as hard as he can, calling him Lord of Darkness. Suddenly, Hellfire arrives at the fallen body of the Demon King, wearing his armor that made him even more imposing and terrifying. He notices the staff floating alone. Apparently, he had been looking for that, concluding that he should have checked earlier because he had been waiting a long time for it. Releasing another creature as large as himself, he picks up the Demon King with one of his hands, saying that Bastard always caused him trouble walking into dangerous places, so he didn't blame his comrade for hating him. In the end, it really was who they thought it was. His comrade says he knew the task he gave was too difficult, calling him General Hellfire. Either way, he believed the hardships were nothing compared to that because the protagonist had lost his memory. The friend asks for his help without fighting the hero, and the general agrees. The guy was too weak and didn't even know if he had the strength or memory to deal with it anyway. He needed to move fast to take him to the right place to end it. Ares apologizes for the long road ahead, but Hellfire says he has no regrets. His friend affirms that if the Demon King managed to regain his strength, he could probably win that inevitable battle, and asks that if things got too bad, he should flee as long as they never found the soul of Hellfire. Disappearing into the air, Ares says he would leave the rest for him to resolve. Something catches the monster's attention as he finds a half-charged shield on the ground. It was probably the belongings of his hero, as if he had been captured and corrupted. Speaking to the unconscious man, he says the skeleton must be tired, so he tells him to rest. He assures him that one day, he will be called a hero. Continuing his journey, he realizes the situation was far worse than he had predicted, so he decides to accelerate the protagonist's recovery. Everything was happening so quickly that eventually they would find the others and he would only be able to hide the truth for a short while. After all, powerful men attracted a lot of attention. Meanwhile, the blind prisoner struggled to open his eyes. In the middle of the forest, the hero walked hooded, visiting a memory of what was once a rebellious hero. In truth, he was just a fool. But there he was staring at Ares' grave. There rested the hero who tried to unite the monsters that had rebelled against the divine. One could even say that the mission of his life was to question the order of existence. Pulling the sword that sat in the ground atop the grave, the boy thought that in some way they had something in common. And maybe, if he followed his path, he would understand his own unease. He tries to push those thoughts away because he knew his feelings were useless there and didn't matter. He had already met many people and saved various places. And if his entire journey had been misguided, he didn't want to meet the goddess. All that uncertainty made the hero question if everything was just in his head. When he arrives at a small village, he meets one of the locals who points him to a restaurant where he could get something. But upon reaching the door, he is surprised by someone being violently thrown out of the establishment. This leaves him completely shocked. A man grabs the clothes of the person who was expelled, looking ready to strike them. But he is stopped by the hero, who questions what he thought he was doing, and threatens the man if he didn't stop that nonsense. Intimidated, he laughs nervously, apologizing and assuring it was just a misunderstanding, asking him to take a look at that little monster. When he looks more closely, he realizes it was just a shadow elf. He sighs, stating that this was a good sign, which only makes the citizen even more irritated, yelling that this monstrous trash caused a huge problem and should apologize to the hero. The child stands up, sobbing, and kneels before the young man, before bowing down and apologizing incessantly for their monstrous existence and for being alive at all, authorizing the hero to step on them or kick them and do whatever he wanted as punishment. In that form, they regretted being born, which leaves the hero somewhat shocked. The man encourages him to let loose and do whatever he wanted to that creature. But the hooded man says it's alright and that he wanted to ask the boy something a little strange. Though confused, the child allows him to say whatever he wanted. So he asks, regardless of whether they were a monster or a human, wasn't the person in front of him just a child? And would he do the same to a human child? Just the idea was already absurd for the man to conceive, saying he couldn't even imagine something so terrible. However, he steps on the elf's head, stating that this was different and he had to apply the law to the monster. In that case, the hero asks if he was trying to say that this specific orphan was a murderer, something the man denies as he didn't even know because it didn't matter. If it was a monster, it didn't need a reason, and he hoped it would just die already. With a smile on his face, he brags about having made skewers from the child's mother and fed them to her. This leaves the hero appalled while the citizen continues laughing at all that torture. After that day, the blonde questioned many others beyond that man. And all the people he met, regardless of being saints or nobles, spoke of monsters with great hatred in their hearts. Each of those interactions made his rage grow even more, because no matter where they came from or what race they were, all humans united in this hatred. But he was different. He had been raised to like everyone and be someone compassionate and kind no matter what. Yet even so, he felt a hatred for the saints in his heart toward the monsters, as if his mind were being manipulated by rage and fury. He didn't know how that hero who was visiting the grave escaped those thoughts, wondering if it was something supernatural. Then, while digging in the forest, he heard a loud roar that caught his attention. It was a huge knight with slow steps, wielding the same sword he had found on Arya's grave. Looking at that beast, the hero questions who it was. Its words are like grumbles, leaving the boy confused. The creature kneels on the ground, dragging a good part of the sword into it, prompting the boy to ask if everything was alright, or if something was wrong with him. However, a great circle of light emerges from the ground where the monster struck the sword, and the boy didn't know exactly what was happening. It was as if the monster were exploding from within, causing a huge gust of wind in the area. The hero watched that force carefully. He knew he couldn't match the monster alone. So he uses his own sword to gain strength with a lightning enchantment across the blade, and quickly points it at that monster, which now had a kind of face on one of its arms. But it doesn't even take a second for the sword to break, leaving him shocked. It shatters before him as if it were nothing, while the beast summons the electric field of the Sword of Death, which was an ability identical to the hero's. He is quickly launched through the air with immense power, being enveloped by a ball of light that amplifies and throws him far away. It was indeed a very powerful creature that he had no idea what it could be. The explosions didn't stop while the boy tried to protect himself. The two engage in a relentless clash using techniques like the triple lightning strike and the electrified death number 5, another ability similar to the humans. He had to admit that aside from the shared abilities, he was on a much lower level than his enemy. He hadn't expected to be overwhelmed so badly, and there was no more room for hesitation. He pulls the sword again toward the opponent as he focuses. Now he would have to give it his all, no matter how it affected the world around him. He hadn't experienced something like this since he fought the Lord of Darkness. So he speaks to his ancestral titan, calling upon him to show his rage and destroy everything. He was going to use the sword of the Incredible King. He was ready to cast that spell. When the monster finally speaks, it says he is very strong and should have already defeated the Dark Lord. It continues, asking him to heed his warning, for he could still achieve his goals if he withdrew. To do so, he had to discard his thoughts of that world, but it already knew he wouldn't listen because he was just like them. He had no idea who it meant by them, and the monster replies that he's asking the right questions, affirming that nothing was right in that world. If he thought it was a big deal to die and be reborn, it was because he was stupid enough not to see that what he was protecting was pure illusion. After all, heroes were just protectors of the world's creations, so it repeats that if he was satisfied with the state of that world, he should close his eyes and walk away. However, if he still wanted to switch sides, he should listen. And calling him hero, ironically, it warns that he would lose everything. With this warning given, the beast says farewell to the boy, feeling pity for his arrogant gods. As it vanishes into the air, a small chain falls at the hero's feet, but it's the pendant that draws his attention, for it was Arya's ornament, which makes him wonder if he had just faced the fate of all heroes. Only a single tear had fallen, and now his worldview was falling apart. Writhing on the ground, he felt the discomfort of reflecting on his future, and questioned what it meant to be a hero after all. Back to our boy. Now he was wandering alone between the limbo of life and death. Everyone had disappeared, and he had no idea how long he'd been unconscious. Either way, he needed to protect his staff at all costs, or it too would vanish. He was aware that it carried a power far greater than he could handle, so he had to do something about it. He couldn't afford to be weak at that moment, but he admitted being tired of those stupid humans. Inside a cabin, the slime celebrated that someone had finally woken up since that person had slept like a baby, and lectured him about how foolish it was to think he could solve everything alone. Giving credit to Hellfire for saving him, he apologizes for worrying his friend. The blob claims it was so worried that its body looked like Swiss cheese full of holes. Ignoring all that, the protagonist asks if the slime had shrunk because of the anxiety. However, the slime asks what he's talking about. He's the one who changed and tells him to look in the mirror. When he finally sees his reflection, he is surprised. He had taken on a much larger form, completely different from before. The slime assumes his friend's old form to ask if that wasn't what he used to look like, shocking the protagonist with how it could morph into something so complex. It praises the new generation, saying how incredible Lord of Darkness was, to which the little creature responds that he shouldn't boast so much or he'd bring ruin to his own kind. Our boy asks if he couldn't handle a joke, and the little blob replies that they were lucky the queen was locked up. When asked if she was safe, the slime says at least her body was, but her mind had been deeply disturbed and it invites him to visit her. So you could see where they were and what had happened during his reincarnation. Outside the gate, screams could be heard from someone who couldn't wait any longer, saying that everyone from the fortress had come to visit except those guys. He questions the protagonist, asking who he was. He wasn't even an elder to be showing up uninvited, until a skeletal figure tells the servant to calm down, as they were guests of the queen and hadn't come earlier because the MC had been sleeping. Besides, they were even more important than the elders, which shocks the guy, because he didn't know what that meant. After all, in the social pyramid, the base was made up of the younger people, the middle by the adults, and the top by the elders. But the slime interrupts, saying his pyramid wasn't self-sufficient, since they were older than the elders. Calling him a child, the Demon King tells them to stop changing the subject because he still had no idea where he was, and the skeleton says he had heard a lot about him because of his friend. He introduces himself as Torito, one of the servants and the Watcher Kinner, and explains that he was caught in a battle during his journey, something unthinkable at the time because the world was in a terrible state. Everything went to hell after the fall of the Lord of Shadows. Even though he was a tyrant, things got much worse without him there. The protagonist said they were all wrong if they thought that could have been avoided, because there was nothing to be done and nothing would change. And the skeleton even agrees with him. Changing the subject, he explains that they were in an abandoned human castle they were repairing to use as a guild. There, they had all kinds of monsters, from underground worms to harpies and corpses. They had all been hunted from their homes and gradually gathered there, lucky to find a place that humans avoided. At the end of the explanation, the blob asks if they would also join that community. The skeleton said the queen had taken good care of them in the past, so they would be well welcomed there, but recommends they greet the leader of the place. In that case, the Demon King asks where he was. With a completely different expression and posture, the Watcher says he would guide the older guys. Arriving at the throne of that king, the protagonist thanks him for the hospitality and apologizes for the delay in meeting him. He was a three-headed raven, the chief of that place. Out of nowhere, the guy freaks out, screaming and asking why he was stuck doing those things, leaving the protagonist confused. Even so, he continues freaking out, saying the situation only got worse each day and he couldn't stay there anymore. They only made him the leader because he was smart, and they came to that conclusion because he liked to read. He even grew more heads to be able to read more, but now he worried 3 times as much. He couldn't take care of all that and didn't have a support team to deal with the madness of the humans. He was already starting to worry about the fate of that place, which makes the Demon King ask what exactly the humans were doing. And the Raven explains that they were patrolling the area with a large army to cleanse the world, and that force kept growing, especially near where they were because something strange was happening around the humans' base as their army's level was rising rapidly. The protagonist asks if the chief had ever heard of the enlightened Vargoski, which he had. He'd heard rumors about the Burning Lion. People usually said he was a brutal and untouchable idiot, something about him having special powers and being close to the hero. The Demon King takes the opportunity to inform him that he had already been to his base and defeated him. This seems to take the chief by surprise as he asks if he was being serious, and our boy confirms it. With that information, he digs his claw into the Demon King's shoulder and says he must be really strong, then invites him to rule that place alongside him, begging him to because he was overwhelmed. The Raven even assures him that he would only need to lead the battles and begs him, saying he'd just have to deal with the defenses of the place. However, all the Demon King says is that he wanted to see the castle first, and while walking around, he notices it wasn't a bad place, just a bit run down. Ideally, they could start replacing the wooden structures with stone ones over time, but they didn't have any time for that, so they had to double the layers. Besides that, they would need soldiers for the counterattack. He asks where his staff was, and the blob suggests that Hellfire must have saved it, explaining that the elf had mentioned something about level 1 of the seal breaking and about how he thought it wasn't even a staff. Surprised that Gimlet was still alive, the protagonist asks how she was, and his friend said she had returned to the village of the Shadow Elves. According to him, with everything going wrong, she needed to make some preparations. Changing the subject, our boy says they should meet with the queen soon. However, an unexpected presence paralyzes him. A very familiar man with a hat and glasses calls out to the protagonist and bows his head to thank him on behalf of everyone from the fortress for being saved by the Demon King. He laments not having been able to protect the fortress, and now Alicia was dead. He couldn't protect a single soul. He just ran away like a rat as always. He admitted that if there was ever a moment to be a hero, he had lost it. He could have at least taken Alicia's place, and it was pathetic that an old man was in that situation. Now the queen's sister lived another life, which was a tragedy. However, he stated that he would not accept that her destiny was death, because Alicia did not live just to die. And he wanted the queen to know that too, though he admitted he wasn't very good with words. Now Aliclimax was very weak. In opening the door to her chambers, he wished the Demon King could give her a reason to live. The scene he finds when she opens the door is terrifying. So terrifying that she herself asks him not to look at her too much. She was lying on the bed, saying she knew she shouldn't be in that state because she was a queen and needed to pull herself together soon. After all, she needed to strengthen that castle and encourage those arriving from the fortress. But she lamented that if she had gotten the right reinforcements, she could have prevented many things. Deep down, she felt like it was all her fault and that she had to act responsibly and fix everything. However, she didn't even know where to start and said she didn't know what to do, as if she were talking to her sister. The Demon King stays silent for a moment, wondering if she had been hurting all this time. He breaks the silence, saying he had something to give her, noticing that she looked very pale and seemed like she hadn't slept in years. The MC pulls a ring from his clothes and the queen laughs, saying she couldn't see without her crown and asking them to just hand over the item already. However, he assures her that she wouldn't need the crown to know what it was and simply asks that she be careful when receiving it in her hand. Upon realizing it was one of her sister's belongings, the girl falls into tears again on the bed. The blob says his friend should say something to Aliclimax, but he quickly says he has nothing to say and was never good at comforting people, so for now, all he could do was stay by her side. And so he did, lifting her from the bed. In her hands, the girl held a kind of knife she had used for a long time to hurt herself. However, before she could do anything foolish again, he pulls that object from her hand, making the girl angry, landing several punches on the guy's skin. But that aggression turns into a long hug, one she had seemingly needed for a long time. The Demon King gently lays the queen back on the bed without letting go of her, and he reminds her that he would stay by her side as long as she needed. So the two remain there, lying on the bed, indulging in their sorrow. Later that same day in the United Kingdom of Graf at East Tamalia, the enlightened Lady of Water, Winkarina, was shocked by what she heard about the Flaming Lion. She woman stopped talking about how they must have been wrong about the facts, since he was one of their strongest warriors, yet the informant was certain he had been defeated. Meanwhile, Enfeet, the Right Hand of Wisdom, commented that the rumors hadn't spread too far yet, but they wouldn't be able to contain them for much longer. Even the Sacred King was taking the whole case very seriously, and the girl shouts that of course he was, because the Enlightened Ones weren't just strong, they were like living emblems of the United Kingdoms. According to her, they carry the nation on their backs and their actions shape the future, so people would be deeply concerned about the boy's death. Sure, the Lord of Darkness had been defeated, but they were still not safe, and it was the worst possible time for this to happen. Enfeet extends his hand to show something he had received from the Sacred King to help control the situation. The object in his hand leaves Winkarina stunned. It was their best secret weapon, the armor of the sealed spirit. Gilead, the short one in the group, is surprised because just using that armor could destabilize entire nations, so much so that its use had only been authorized once in the battle against the Demon King. However, Enfeet argues that losing an enlightened one could destabilize their nation, so they needed to respond swiftly and precisely. He rolls the dice and asks the girls to pick them up, stating that they should use them as quickly as possible. Gilead is the first to question why he was choosing her, since the other companions would be more useful. Then he explains that just as Winkarina said, all their movements shaped the nation. And since she was the only elf among the enlightened ones, she symbolized the alliance between elves and humans, so he was making a strictly political decision. Accepting her fate, the girl says she'll need a few support knights, asking only for the best of the best warriors. And so it would be done. On the roof of the building, Carlos was thinking about how he had no real interest in that stupid toy, but still found the idea of using them at least somewhat interesting. It would be very interesting to face the person who had struck him, the same one who defeated the Flaming Lion. If they managed to defeat him in this battle, it would be very significant, but his moments of reflection are interrupted when someone calls him Grandpa. The shouting doesn't stop, questioning Carlos' whereabouts as he sighs tired. Because of that, he quickly comes down from the roof. He meets the hero's son, who'll be described as extremely irritating. He was very careless and had no idea of the weight he carried on his shoulders. Back at the new monster fortress, the crow is shouting, looking for the protagonist. His servants explain that Lord Algo was working on the inner walls of the place, which calms him down a bit. When he finds him, he questions why he was making all that noise, as when the boss shouts, everyone else gets annoyed too, something the crow found irrelevant. He informs that the humans were heading to the fortress with their new nation of cleansing, bringing two illuminated with them. They were going there to avenge the Flaming Lion. Since they didn't know who was responsible for his death, they were destroying everyone. The chief angrily says it was all the Demon King's fault, so he should be the one to take responsibility since there was no reason to bring them along. Tarek catches up in the middle of the confusion, saying they had misunderstood everything and asking for a little calm. It doesn't take long for the crow to recognize that he didn't belong to that fortress, so the man introduces himself as the bell ringer. Returning to the topic, the people explained they had heard that the man in front of them had killed the Flaming Lion, so it was natural to draw their own conclusions. However, Tarek argues that if he hadn't done it, the whole place would have been destroyed and they would have witnessed a real massacre. He reveals that the Illuminated burned his house to ashes, so he knew them very well. This last piece of information manages to shock the crow. Showing the scarf he wore, Tarek claims to have used it to wipe off the juice of his friends who ended up unrecognizable. According to him, that man attacked his village, destroyed the nearby fortress, and finished off all the monsters he found. Yet they were spared. And he questions if the chief really thought it was a coincidence, and if he'd be happy if they all just packed up and left, which leaves the crow speechless. And he confesses that he simply didn't know what to do from that point on. Interrupting the conversation, the bubble asks when they would stop arguing, as it was completely useless at the moment. After all, there was no point in pointing fingers, since they needed to work together to do everything they could. They should give it their all and unite once and for all, just like the humans were doing. Reflectively, the Demon King asks what he could do now. After some time, the crow questions if he really needed to stay there to check his war potential. And the MC explains that if the chief left, his men would lose the will to fight. Then he begins recognizing his soldiers. The worm, Vrina the Harpy, Armas, and the undead Weta, all chiefs. Surprised by their presence, he asks what they were doing there, to which the group responds that they heard the chief shouting that a war was about to begin. He stammers trying to say something in response to that, but is interrupted by the Demon King, who is much more articulate, and asks which of the three knew how to fight. The monsters explain that some had been part of the Shadow King's army, but they were at a disadvantage. They were monsters, not soldiers, and couldn't defeat trained fighters. Vrina confesses she was already expecting a war but didn't think it would happen so soon, while Armas states he heard they'd be fighting an army much larger than theirs. And Widow was worried about what they would tell their children, because if they needed to increase the number of soldiers, the women and children would have to fight too, and even so, they would likely lose the war. Basically, they were being told to go to the battlefield and be annihilated, which was at the very least cruel. The skeleton laments not having the Dark King to guide them at that moment, but the protagonist doesn't let them lose hope, saying they would prepare in the castle hall. Besides, no one would be forced. He asks them to choose their warriors. He is supported by the crow, who says they would leave the option of escaping to each community chief. In the end, they were trying to recruit potential warriors, not just anyone. Now gathered in the hall, some monsters were watching the new chiefs attentively. There were expressions of fear in their eyes, and the Demon King comments that they were just children. But one of the harpies steps forward and shouts that they had already decided they were going to fight, arguing that all of them were useful for something, whether flying or throwing pebbles around. One of them yells that they wouldn't lose to mere humans and begs to be allowed to go. Suddenly, the girl is interrupted by a third person who asks her to hold that offer for a moment. That voice was very familiar to the protagonist. Then its owner jumps down from the building he was on, landing near the friends in the hall and claiming that those adorable children didn't belong in that place because they weren't soldiers, so only adults should be allowed. It was Gimlet, the creative master, surprising everyone there with his arrival. He states that he didn't come alone, revealing several goblins ready to go to war. There were creatures from everywhere, from the northeastern cave to the southern river, and from the Shimatsuki Valley. They had traveled that entire land looking for someone who could fight, and so they found them. He guaranteed he had brought the best reinforcements. However, the Demon King questions whether he hadn't understood that the enemy army numbered in the thousands, led by the Illuminated, so it was a real war, not just any battle in a village. But Gimlet claims that this was exactly why he was there. If they stayed waiting, they would be subdued. They had already been attacked before. And the monsters agree with him that there was no reason to wait. If they destroyed that place, they would just keep advancing, and they couldn't sit idly by. Besides, they had heard something about an uproar at a human base that ended with the death of one of the Illuminated. There was a rumor that spread like wildfire, and before they knew it, they were heading to the fortress because if the Demon King could do it, why couldn't they? They were willing to at least try to fight if they were going to die, and if they survived, at least they would have a new Dark Lord. Seeing all that movement, the bubble states they had to accept the warriors because it was the right thing to do, even though the protagonist found it all very idiotic. But if it was their wish, he declares that if they wanted to die, he would show them the cauldron of hell, warning that their enemies' arrows would fall like rain and swords would swing like a sandstorm against their skin. Their throats would dry up, their bones would break, and even their fangs might crack, and shadow would consume their faces, darkness even greater than the night. However, they would not lose, would not succumb, and would never be destroyed, because their bonds would ignite a flame, and with it, they would paint the dark sky red. Sometime later, Gimlet praises the guy's speech, saying it was amazing what a man could do. In just 3 days, he had changed a lot, though to the protagonist, only his exterior had changed. He takes advantage of the boy's presence to ask about an object he had found. According to Gimlet, it was what was left of his staff, and Hellfire must have given it to him. In fact, when he brought him back, it was shining like crazy. He even tried to mess with the thing in the meantime, but its energy belonged to the queen. And then it turned into that thing, which he found really weird. All he knew about it was that its seal had many layers, and to open them would require a lot of power and a strong soul too. This talk about souls makes the protagonist question him, and Gimlet explains that basically the seal tried to protect the item's powers from those who were not worthy. At least that was his theory, but maybe it was just divine power. After all, it was the kind of item that could be as ancient as the late Emperor Impera. However, to the elf, it was clear that the person who broke the seal first was his friend. Either way, they had a war on the way, and it wasn't time to focus on something like that. They could talk more about it after everything was settled. The bubble enters the hall to inform the Demon King that Hellfire would protect everyone who decided to leave. Meanwhile, the queen hadn't moved a muscle, so the protagonist decides to let Thiago take care of it. Amidst all this chaos, the chief feels his stomach ache with the progress of the preparations, but they were doing their best and agreed with that despite the crow's anxious palpitations. The war would happen either way, so it was good to know they managed to unite different races to fight together. In his speech, the Demon King states that he thought he had to do everything alone, but if he really had to, he didn't know if he could. The fortress's monsters were very helpful, and they thank him for those words. The guy seems hesitant for a moment, which makes the crow curious. Then the Demon King explains that he was starting to understand why everyone chose him as the chief there. Before he can explain further, the ground begins to shake, jostling the bubble and setting off an alarm in the local leader. The humans had finally arrived, and were passing through the forest and knocking everything down with their army. He knew the magnitude of the warriors, but his body couldn't help but be astonished. Yet the king shifts his focus, asking if he can see the two on top of that giant thing. They were Winkarina and Gilia, the Illuminated sent by the group. Down below, Winkarina was organizing her army, saying that the end of the cleansing was near and they had finally arrived where they wanted. The monsters had used their old castle to arm themselves against them. They would enter a monstrous castle, a truly frightening place, but they should not fear anything. All the men there should carry themselves as proud warriors. Only then would they bring vengeance for their fallen warrior Vargoski. She would drown her enemies in her own juice, and everything would be done in the name of the goddess. So one of the knights authorizes the attack, and Winkarina sighs heavily before shouting for them to go all in. The archers promptly launch their arrows toward the fortress, but before they hit any of the monster warriors, they explode in the air, turning to ash. This leaves the crow dumbfounded, but the protagonist explains that it was all thanks to the incredible barrier made by the Dark Elves. It was essentially made of fire barriers placed in various locations. It wasn't easy to break them, especially for a lone army. Besides that, this protection had an offensive use too, because when they launched something, the barrier would add a flaming effect, setting your spears on fire, which would cause extensive damage to opponents without extinguishing the fire on the spears. When the men are hit by those things, chaos erupts. Even the ground caught fire at that moment. That's when one of the knights noticed that the ground they were stepping on was soaked in oil. This leaves him very confused because when they arrived, he was sure the ground was dry. But there's no time to think about it as he hears a rumble beneath his feet. Now that land, which was once solid, had begun to break apart, causing some of their warriors to fall into very deep holes. They were desperate and screamed for it to stop. The ones responsible for this were the earthworms that swallowed old fallen soldiers. They were spewing oil from the soil and managed to break the soldiers' formation, which makes the humans certain that this was not just a powerful army, but also a general who knew war very well. The Demon King states that this was enough and the worms should retreat because now it was time for the dancing lion. Then he orders the preparations for this new show to begin. They spend their equipment with vigor, ready for the attack. With everything set, the protagonist commands them to fire, launching a huge barrel toward the opponents. They are surprised by that thing flying through the air, questioning what exactly it was. When they finally realize it's a barrel, it's already too late, and the item explodes, sending several humans flying in all directions. It was a bomb that scattered its fragments everywhere. One of the soldiers notices it's full of metal scraps and broken nails, which indicated that it was made from leftover parts. One of them is hit in the eye by the barrel's contents, screaming in pain, and it's only a matter of time before others suffer from it too. The explosions were less dangerous than the fragments that injured the warriors, especially the ones from lower ranks who couldn't defend themselves. It was a very good plan because for every wounded soldier, a second warrior had to leave combat to help them. They used an efficient but very cruel tactic. That's when Karina, mounted on a giant creature, ordered the rest of the men to retreat because she would handle it. She was in shock. She had never encountered an enemy like that before and suggests that her friend's killer could be among them. In any case, it would be a good opportunity to test her strength, so she commands her beast to advance. And so it does, like a wild beast charging toward that massive barrier. That alone manages to destroy the monster's protection with a single hit, which makes the Demon King realize that the Illuminated possessed overwhelming power. He stares at the shadow formed in front of him with curiosity and maybe fear. Now he was face to face with that enormous thing, followed by Winkarina, who tells him not to die just yet because she wants to see his full potential. Surprisingly, he does not back down, assuring that he would be the one to drive the girl out of the castle, and asks the crow to handle the rest. Then advancing toward the girl, he calls her out for a fight, assuring that he would be a worthy opponent. His request leaves the crow astonished, unsure if he was really being serious, but the bubble quickly steps in, asking to help him out. It calls the Dark Elves to rebuild another barrier while the orcs prepare for combat, and the archers are to take down anyone trying to get close. Meanwhile, the aerial battle continued relentlessly. with the Demon King's powers at their peak, defending himself from the girl who was launching several water spheres in his direction. It was too much even for the protagonist. He wondered where she had pulled all that from because it couldn't be just magic. After all, there was no water source nearby, not even on the ground. So he needed an explanation for how she could manipulate something that wasn't even there. Apparently, she was even drawing water from the trees. When Karina states that with her spiritual armor, she was more powerful than one could imagine, reaching the hero's level. The girl said that even though Vargoski was dead, she would demonstrate all the attributes of the Illuminated, forming a sort of tsunami right there, which catches the young man by surprise because they were in the middle of a forest. Moreover, she managed to create a huge elephant just from water, which was absurd. Actually, 2 elephants that cornered our protagonist. Even so, the girl thought her attacks lacked precision. In that case, she needed to check the casualties by coming down from where she was to do it. The Demon King suddenly appears behind the girl, but doesn't seem to surprise her. Although he was stronger than she expected, she knew she couldn't keep running from him. When Karina boasts that she could crush that castle in a blink of an eye, which makes our guy think she wanted a hand-to-hand fight, so he would grant her wish. Around them, the monsters were brawling with the humans using brute force. Now without the barrier, the situation started to tighten because there were so many soldiers there, like a giant anthill, until an uncontrollable beast launched its attack on multiple warriors, causing one of the orcs to comment that he was really fired up. Something catches his attention on the horizon and he asks everyone to look because he didn't know what it was. It was like a beanstalk sprouting from the ground, getting taller and taller. They had no idea what the humans intended to do with that thing, and it was only a matter of time until the tree began to crack all the way down to the soil. The monsters couldn't believe the humans' stupid plan was to drop that thing on top of them. However, with its increasing size, the orcs shouted for everyone to get out of there quickly. The problem was that the tree was starting to reach the castle walls, which were made of wood, completely destroying her physical protection. Noticing that chaos, when Karina realized her team was very dedicated to winning, and now that she was finishing testing her powers, maybe she should return to the front line. Then she asks if the Demon King wanted to keep going with that, telling him not to be so predictable because if she managed to finish him off, she'd earn a lot of credit. And the monster roars, saying that would only happen in a world where she had the power to do something like that. He extends his tail, now covered in spikes because of the enchantment he cast. But that doesn't impress the girl, who says the protagonist promises too much. When he launches the spikes, it doesn't take long for her to stop them. Smiling, she claims her opponent wasn't even close to her expectations, and suggests he stop that pathetic, useless resistance of his, leaving him in the dust. Even dripping juice, the guy stands up, saying the girl really was stronger than he thought. He was in checkmate. And when Karina begins a speech about how Julia was right behind her with an army of thousands, accompanied by Vargoski's guards, the 3 Flame Knights. Besides, now that the beanstalk had risen, she was sure the humans were invading the monster kingdom. In reality, they must have already taken everything in the time they had been talking. Inside the fortress, the 3 Flame Knights were preparing to launch a full invasion. One of them followed solemnly, as it was the first fight they fought without their leader, being scolded by a comrade who argued they had to give it their all to honor Vargoski's sacrifice. Otherwise, the 2 Illuminated would get all the credit for the victory. They were sure the general was still in there, hidden behind the castle wall, which was perfect, because as soon as they finished off their boss, all the monsters would face the Flame Knight clan. But something surprisingly appears in their path. It was Thiago, asking how the men were doing and explaining that regardless of what they were looking for, they wouldn't find it there, and if they wanted to prove something, it was better to leave. The men stared at him curiously, unsure if he was a monster. But there was something even more interesting behind him, a gate, and what better target? It was on a bridge, which was a classic defense tactic, and if he had any scruples, he should have used a drawbridge. However, the group is surprised by some creaks on the bridge, showing that they were right, but Tarek states that the humans were very arrogant, as the planks began to fall apart beneath their feet. Only they managed to create magic circles preventing themselves from falling, repeating that the monsters had no sense of tactics whatsoever. Even so, Tarek stands firm, saying he wouldn't let them pass even if it was the last thing he did in his life. If they took one step forward, they'd be nothing more than minced meat. But the guys couldn't care less, and attacked Tarek relentlessly like cowards in a 3-against-1 clash. Even so, the monster keeps defending himself and tries not to give in to the blows, when suddenly he's struck right in the face, having to hear that he let his guard down. And one of the knights states he's going to finish him off, pointing his blade at him. However, he's stopped by the man's strength, who jumps while driving a stake into the ground. Next, Tarek leaps toward the jerk, ready for a counterattack. One of the knights claims he won't let him land a blow, but the monster shouts that he won't back down, surprising the guys with an explosion between them. Tarek was determined not to let that fight be lost, continuing his attacks until he finishes off one of the knights. He adjusts his glasses, now cracked from the impact, staring down those 2 idiots. He begins his speech about a broken and rusty white sword that he held with his juice-covered hand from the land of demon kings, stating that his only goal was peace, but if that wasn't possible, he would follow the path of death that whispered in his ear, telling him never to reach the abyss. Meanwhile, In the corner of the battle, the monsters were trying to protect their entrance at all costs, and the bubble was commanding them, shouting for them to guard it with their lives, because if the humans got through, they would come like an avalanche. The situation at the front was chaotic after the beanstalk opened a hole in the fence, and one of the orcs complained about it. He already had many arrows in his back and felt like they couldn't hold on much longer. Sensing that discouragement, other monsters stepped up to move to the front line, arguing that the queen had given them life and now was time to give back. So with long strides, they reached the battlefield, scaring the other warriors who asked what they thought they were doing. After all, they were trolls, which meant they were big enough to be huge targets right there at the front. But one of the big ones used that to his advantage, saying they could use them as a shield. Even if they ended up eliminated, they risked to keep being used as walls. Starting a lesson in destruction, he declares that this was their stage and they should let them act. It didn't take long for the humans' arrows to fly in their direction, and the guys defended themselves with massive wooden planks, but never very successfully, because little by little, they were getting hit. One of the human knights jumps toward a troll who grabs him with his hand, completely destroying him. The scene is indeed desperate, with wounded people everywhere. And after some time, all the monsters are on the ground, allowing the soldiers to advance and coordinate to keep moving forward. Now they had control of the castle gate. One of them yells for everyone to enter and calls the others to follow him, beginning the attack. However, before that happens, they're hit by a massive wave. It was definitely Winkarina's magic, but they didn't understand why she was stopping them from entering. One of the knights yells to the commander that they should abort the invasion and regroup in the field immediately, which he finds ridiculous since they had just reached the gate. Even so, the man insists, stating that the fire was spreading through the field and they needed to focus on putting it out because there was a forest fire. Back to the protagonist, the Illuminated asks if something is wrong with her, because her breathing was very heavy, and he declares there would be no rest for the girl, throwing multiple explosions in her direction, which she tries to dodge to protect herself. Provoking her, the protagonist asks if she's sure she just wants to defend, because if she didn't hurry up, everything would turn to dust. All the trees were already dry because the girl took all the water from there, and it would serve as the perfect fuel for the Demon King's powers. In disbelief, Winkarina asks how much kindling he made with that cheap trick, kicking what must have been an entire forest reduced to twigs at that point. To which the guy responds that even a small spark could become a massive flame, and asks if her soldiers were okay. Continuing, he states that if the girl lost her entire army, she would starve to death, and an army that size with no supplies would become nothing more than a group of refugees. Of course, the MC planned to make that an impossible task. Amidst all this chaos, Tarek continued battling the other two warriors. They were already certain he wasn't just any goblin. They were elite knights among the elite, but they already had one man down, the man of prodigious strength. Then the bald one begins his offensive, being struck quickly by the guy, surprised by Tarek's power. He was an insanely strong enemy, and they knew they wouldn't win without 100 more sacrifices, so he was willing to give his life if it meant victory. He charges toward the man and tells his friend to inform the rest of the clan that victory would rebuild the group. He had to say goodbye now because even if his body died, his soul would always remain beside the blazing lion. He was activating the ruin ability, which made his friend realize what was about to happen. Even so, the bald one charges forward, roaring as his powers are released. He and the monster begin a relentless clash, so intense it launches even the goblin, who had resisted up until now, near the gate. Now that he was cornered, he was willing to give his all to end that monster. Ready to sacrifice his life, he calls out and demands that he give his best. Behind him, his friend thinks that he hasn't even used the ruin ability yet. It was something that would push him to the limits of his physical abilities, but it should only be used for short periods, since even after a short time, the dilation continued, giving more power to the one using the ability, but also reaching lethal levels. When he appears to be at the peak of this magic wave, the bald one launches his strikes at Tarek. He was truly cornered and couldn't do anything, and the man in front of him was screaming, until finally finishing off his opponent. At this point, the gate itself had already been destroyed, and the other knight celebrates their victory, which doesn't last long as the bald one promptly collapses to the ground. He approaches, asking if his friend was okay or if it had been too much for him to handle. Then he notices some pieces of wood lodged in his body. They could have been fragments from that gate, but it had all happened so fast, until he hears a voice coming from behind the two of them, saying he had defeated someone and gained everything. It was Tarek lying there in front of them, so it probably wasn't him who was speaking. They had reached the queen, who repeated that she had told the guy to run and question why he was still there and if it was her fault. She was breaking down, not knowing why she couldn't leave her behind and asking what she had done to deserve that. Speaking with her sister in her mind, Ali Khalifa says she couldn't go on with that, and begged for it all to end soon because she was very tired. Full of rage, the knight gets closer and closer, taking advantage of the girl not being able to see anything. But before he can strike the girl, he's surprised by Tarek, who quickly gets up, and with his spear in hand, launches his offensive, striking the man right in the neck, who screams that he would take the monster with him wherever he went, pointing his blade. This surprises the guy, but he knew he wasn't the target, and he yells for his majesty. In the middle of the forest, the fire continued, and the Demon King tells the Illuminated to stop being so stubborn. She was clearly exhausted and could only think that she'd gotten herself into a colossal mess. That armor the monster was wearing was extremely powerful, and she had already lost all sense of what was normal. Even with all her years of experience, she could feel the earth trembling, as Carlos had mentioned earlier, and now she understood because these weren't abilities they use often. Ironically, the equipment was what allowed her to reverse the situation, because she was still at an advantage like it or not, especially since her army was focused on putting out the fire, which meant that reinforcements would soon arrive. All she needed was to buy some time to win, and that's exactly what the Demon King says. Surprising the girl by reading her thoughts, he says he really was having a hard time. He thought that place would burn much faster, but his warriors were taking care of it very well. He was finally on the offensive, but even so, they were at a disadvantage. Facing all of that, the girl now understands that the monster in front of her was responsible for Vargoski's death, something he confirms, assuring her she would be next. With her head down, Karina thinks she might buy a little more time and distract him by talking, but there was no point if he already knew. The king continues, saying he intended to finish her quickly and before the carousal calmed, move on to the next. He could no longer waste his time with her, so it was time for subjugation. After all, he had already learned that she had taken down his favorite guard. He closes himself inside a sort of giant flower, generating immense energy. Karina asks what that was. It looked like a trump card, and she wasn't sure if he intended to attack her with just that. She was still trembling in anticipation, until she realized there was no reason for that. She was an illuminated and on his level. However, the flower slowly opens, confirming that something tremendous was about to happen. When the Demon King steps out from inside, his form was completely different from before, much larger and covered in armor. And he says that at least they had reached the end of the girl's story, praising her for making it so far in battle. The protagonist says that to honor that strength, he would use all the power he had left, but he wouldn't stay there much longer. By now, Karina was sure he was just making excuses because he couldn't win that fight. She was drenched in sweat, couldn't breathe, and trembled as if her whole body was screaming, telling her to run, but the first thing out of her mouth is a compliment about the Demon King's new outfit. And she asked if he was going to show his dance to her, thinking she was an illuminated, so if she was going to die, it had to be the right way. Serious, the monster says he already told her this was the end, striking her straight in the chest. The king says he had no intention of attending the girl's ball, who was already lying on the ground. Now it was time to return to his castle because he had stayed there longer than he should have, and he said he hoped all his soldiers were well. Surprisingly, the girl responds saying that even if he left, she wouldn't die so easily. She was an illuminated. By draining her own life, her spiritual armor would take her beyond her limits. Her forbidden spells would now be easy to cast. When our boy tries to attack her with a sword, it backfires, and when Karina explains that she could now turn her body into water, which was at the very least inconvenient. But the man holds his stance, saying there was no reason for her to keep resisting her own fate. Ignoring him, the illuminated invokes her evaporation power, striking the protagonist's shoulder, who states that if he couldn't finish her with a sword, it would be through fire. Either way, her fate was already sealed. Full of rage, Karina says she couldn't stand dying unless she could at least choose how. Mocking her, the Demon King declares that form of hers wouldn't last long because if it were truly viable, she would have started the fight like that. But either way, she was determined to buy some time, so she would stay there as long as she could, and the monster in front of her would not be able to ignore it. Because according to her, no one defeated the Illuminated without making sacrifices. At the peak of her power, she declares she is Karina, the Lady of Water and protector of the royal city and the majestic sword. Because of all that, she would not retreat. While fighting, she mentally apologizes to Gilia for her incompetence as the girl is startled by the rain now falling upon them. She knew only her friend could chant the Tears of the Saints, a spell on the level of the gods, with a very high cost to cast. She doesn't even have time to fully think it through because someone screams on the horizon that they couldn't do it. It was too much, and they hadn't expected things to reach that point. Down below, the knights shouted that with the death of the Dark Lord, the monsters should have grown weaker, and the Illuminated had promised it would be easy, that there would be no casualties there and everyone would return home safe and sound. But now they realized they were wrong as their men were falling like flies. All their food had already been burned, and they probably wouldn't find any water anywhere nearby. So they asked Gilia to let them leave. The girl is pulled from her thoughts by someone who appears behind her, saying they were confused by the Tears of the Saints, since losing an Illuminated would impact them all. Now it was only a matter of time before the men deserted their posts, and they recognized they needed an Illuminated to boost their morale. The girl's response is far more aggressive than expected, and she calls them useless, grabbing one of the soldiers and wrapping him in several roots. The man complained that his head and body hurt, screaming for her to stop, but Gilia is firm in saying she would only do so when they became useful again. The monster carrying her laughed at the situation, and the Illuminated uses the forbidden spell of soldier sacrifice. One of the knights asks her to do anything else but that. He is interrupted by the girl, who questions who he thought he was to speak to her that way, because she would sacrifice him too. The man is quickly entangled by the tree's hard branches, screaming for Miss Gilia. The screams didn't shake her, as she was fully aware that they were all truly useless, and that rain was making everything even more chaotic. She had no idea what to say to the king now since she hadn't done much in her friend's absence, so the solution was to pretend she had given her all, which was not an easy thing to do. Sitting in her own fortress, she states that everyone there could march toward death. Back at the queen's fortress, she attentively listened to the battle while Tarek was struck right in the middle of his chest. Hearing his scream, she calls out for the boy. He says that Night was annoying even in the end of things. Before falling to the ground, the man apologizes to Lord Vargoski. Undefeated, Tarek pulls the blade from his chest, leaving the queen visibly worried, but he throws the swords to the ground as if they were nothing, sighing deeply. Diana thinks of saying something but stammers. Before she can form a coherent sentence, the guy slaps her in the face, surprising her. He apologizes but says he had heard from the Demon King that his sister had endured a lot of torture. They mess with her teeth, beat her all over, and even so, she didn't say anything, she just endured it all in silence. Then he asked for whom she had done that in the queen's opinion. Now she had decided the fate of those whom Alicia had saved and definitely didn't want things to end that way. Now yelling, Tarak declares that it didn't matter if the girl had to cover herself in dirt or run along the roots of trees. Either way, she had to live. After all, Alicia wouldn't want to see her in the afterlife either, since everyone there needed her help. Of course, he understood it wasn't something easy to do, but it was far better than being controlled by their enemy, which would surely be unpleasant. Continuing his speech, the guy said that horrible things would always appear like real storms. But even without knowing exactly what to do in those scenarios, one had to keep fighting, because all storms passed, and then all that remained was a clear blue sky. He said that now it was raining and celebrated the fact that he had an umbrella for her. But that rain didn't seem normal at all. He was losing strength with every step, and his feet had a very strange tingling. Indeed, it was a very annoying spell, and he asked for some flowers in case he died. Even so, he had hope of at least taking one of the Enlightened's arms. Holding his crooked blade, he firmly declares that he would show all he had and enjoy a moment of pleasure, until he noticed something coming directly from the sky. It looked like a monster when it landed beside him, but it was nothing like the allies. So what could it be? When he finally realized what was happening, he screamed. There was the Demon King in an unrelenting fight against the Enlightened. Facing various knights, that's when he heard one of them say the barrier wouldn't open. He recognized that voice very well. It was his friend Slime, and he asked if it was really him there. Now shedding that knightly form, he says he had already explained that he left when the attack ceased. He took advantage of the strange rain and jumped directly on that wooden soldier. He managed to take down all the others like him, and with the mold made, turned him into a mere puppet. In fact, he was taking care of some very important things when his friend showed up and asked what exactly had happened to him. He soon explained that he was using his trump card, his black coat of melted silver, though it wouldn't last much longer. Julia watched the interaction between the two and the other knights, wondering what they were, because they were definitely not normal. Especially the darker one, who she imagined to be responsible for the deaths of Vargoski and Winkarina. He was obviously imitating Vargoski's form, so he probably consumed him, and she bet his powers were stronger than the original two. All of that made her wonder if she should use her spiritual armor. Meanwhile, the Demon King approaches Tarek, who asks if it was his friend, and he confirms, more concerned about the new scars the boy had gained. Smiling, he says the creature was very insensitive, because that still hurt a bit, taking the chance to ask how they would get out of there, since they were surrounded and very weak. It would be much easier if they were moving, but they were trying to attack the Enlightened, and if they didn't hurry, that wooden monster would finish them off. In that case, he wanted to attack them before the situation got even worse. Tarek suggests he could come up with a plan in the meantime. He's interrupted by the Bubble, who says it felt like cutting grass and asks if they had talked enough already. Then his friend states they were about to get out of there. Observing the movement, Gilead stays alert, suggesting that they must have come up with something last minute. Then the Demon King chants his Chaos spell, blowing up everything in front of them with the Divine Sword's power, and launching an unstoppable attack, which surprises Gilead, who didn't expect them to put the Goblin on the front lines. After all, Tarek was the weakest link in that team. The Bubble continued with his new knight body walking firmly, telling his friend to let him handle that opponent so he could escape. Watching from above, Julia wonders why the soldiers didn't block him, certain the Goblin was planning something. Finally, she realizes they had discovered the soldiers' weaknesses and were using them against them. Due to their size, they couldn't turn easily, so they had many blind spots, and they lost their targets quickly. They used a huge stick to create various obstacles in the soldiers' path so the monster could easily reach their blind spot. Besides that, the other knights seemed very occupied with that wooden fighter in front of them, who was moving incorrectly to create a distraction, hindering her men from searching for the lost enemy. She had to admit they were very observant, as it didn't take long for the monsters to identify their weaknesses. Now it made sense that Winkarina hadn't been able to fight them. Down below, his blade had teeth before he began to climb the giant wooden creature, getting very close to Gilead. However, the girl throws him far away, making the guy scream. With a psychopathic look, Gilead tells him not to mess with her, making some roots grow to trap the boy, and states that it didn't matter how strong he was because he was just a goblin, so he would never be able to eliminate her. That's when she notices a very strange movement behind her, a massive creature flying toward her. It was the Demon King in all his power. which makes the little girl scream, trying to defend herself from the guy's massive blade. Laughing, Julie praises him for escaping her search team, saying she had to give him credit for that. But he states that her efforts hadn't been enough since the girl's plan to take him down using the knights had failed. She keeps defending herself, saying he would have done the same and that wood was very weak against fire, so that would have been his end. But now she had that miraculous rain on her side, claiming she already knew the Lady of Fire had used her life to activate the Tears of the Saints, which not only extinguished the Demon King's flames, but also poisoned the monsters and helped plants grow even stronger. With rage in her body, the Enlightened declares that there was a reason they had implemented that strategy. They also knew his weaknesses. Even so, the protagonist doesn't back down and says it didn't matter what she did, because the result would always be the same. He would wipe out her race, stating they had reached the end of the line. However, he is surprised by a strike from one of the giant beasts Gilly summoned that throws him far away. The bubble runs toward his friend to make sure he's okay, and he grumbles, disappointed with himself, because Tarek had given him a chance and he threw it away just like that. While recovering, he says he wouldn't get another one. And now the opponents knew they had something that could ruin the monster's party. Up above, Julie thought she had come very close to losing because if the guy had shown up minutes earlier, it would have been her end. She needed to stop just observing and finish them off before they could execute their plan, so she would use her sacrifice soldiers and go all in. Focusing, Julia summons her spiritual armor, the Forest King, Drake, giving him full freedom, and the creature goes on devouring everything in sight. From afar, the bubble asks if he's seen this right. They were going all out, and now was time for the monsters to react even without another plan. They needed to give their all since there was no other way out. Then, pulling himself together, the protagonist declares that he was willing to sacrifice his body for the sword. Watching all that chaos from afar, Slime says the girl seems to be starting something, and that huge beast only increases its ferocious roar. They observe its intact roots and branches, wondering why they didn't catch fire. But the point is, that was Gillia's trump card. And in that case, there was only one possibility. That immense creature that went on devouring everything and everyone had transformed into something completely unexpected, taking the form of a massive dragon, which roared louder and louder. It was indeed a very strong creature, but that did not intimidate the Demon King, who quickly identified that its powers were transformation and regrowth. That was because its skin was stronger than metal and would grow back every time it was destroyed. Not only that, but it would grow back even stronger, becoming more powerful as it devoured things in its path. It had already fed on more than 10,000 soldiers and carried all their strength in a single monster. Seeing the creature's posture, the protagonist concluded that not even the hero would want to fight that. But of course, that didn't mean he would lower his guard. With disdain in her eyes, Julia commands her creature to finish off the opponents, and it obeys, trying to strike the Demon King, who screams in despair, while the bubble calls him an idiot, charging forward to save his friend. However, on the first strike he tries to make, his sword breaks, leaving him confused because it was a very strong item. He is also hit by the creature without warning, letting out a scream, yelling for that giant to let go of his friend, because it would finish him off that way. When he notices parts of his body are disintegrating, he suggests the Demon King transform into something smaller to escape the monster's grip, and the protagonist responds that he was trying but couldn't get out of that form as if something were restraining him. The bubble insists, saying he couldn't give up now. He tried to think of what to do with the possibility of controlling his friend through his form, but there wasn't enough time and he definitely couldn't ask anyone for help. Firmly, she tells the king that he had already been resurrected once, so she knew he wouldn't be able to return again if something happened, adding that it would be fine if it were her in his place, but he definitely couldn't die there. Seeing his friend's defeat, Slime is paralyzed, while Gilead declares it was over. However, when the monster opens its claws, she realizes the protagonist had disappeared, which definitely shouldn't be a good sign. A little distance away, our boy reappears, collapsed on the ground with the bubble, who is confused about who had activated the transmission spell. She shakes him, asking if it was him who did it, and if so, why he didn't use the spell earlier, because he really scared her. But the guy quickly explains it wasn't him, because he couldn't do anything under those restraints, especially cast a spell that strong, leaving the creature very lost, until she realizes that she had really done all of that. Near the two stood Diana with her crown like a true queen. She begins her speech saying that he could have made her the villain of the story after saying she was a failure as a queen and that he wished he had left her behind. Not only him, but everyone there kept saying it was okay if she ran away, teaching her many things so that she could do it. But that's when she realized she would rather die than push others to face the same fate. And she declares that even if she arrived late to the war, she would fight. Diana apologizes for taking so long and admits it was foolish not to have realized they needed help earlier, receiving a pat on the head from the Demon King, who celebrates the fact that she was okay as much as possible. The girl smiles, asking why he was so worried about her, but thanks him right away, even before he can respond. She says the pair looked terrible and that she would heal them in 1 second, having to hear the bubble say they only looked bad on the outside. Extending her hand, she helps her friends recover, being surrounded by phenomenal flora that even makes her hair grow, and she sends the healing butterflies in their direction. To the protagonist, the scene looked like a funeral from heaven, while the bubble feels her back tickle and wonders why her hair had grown too. Apparently, the girl's magic was even stronger than when she ran away. Then Alicalifa explains that magic was a skill with purpose and rationality, and she hadn't been thinking logically in the state she was in before. The king asks if, in that case, she could amplify someone else's magic, something the girl confirms, saying it was a basic spell and asking if he needed more power or what, and he replies that if she could do that for him, they might be able to win that war, something she was willing to do. Meanwhile, Gilia searched for her targets atop her dragon, surprised by the fact that not even her search team had managed to find them, until she realizes they were only looking around plants. So if they couldn't find them, it meant they must be in an arid place, like the ruins near the castle, suggesting they had managed to escape because they already had escape plans in place, waiting for the moment they'd need them. She knew she wouldn't be able to reach the two of them with all the traps hidden around the castle, but she had to try anyway until her attention was taken by a massive beam of light coming from inside the city, making her wonder what that strange magical power was, until two shadows emerged from that light. No, they weren't two shadows, but the idiot monsters. At least, that's what she thought. The queen shouted, asking if the Demon King was really okay, making sure he wouldn't explode with all that power inside him, which makes him laugh, telling her not to worry because it was nothing for him and he could keep carrying it. While doing so, Al-Khalifa thought that even without amplification, she believed that power was enough to blind her, and a normal monster would have already reached its limit. She knew he was different, but that was still incredibly impressive. The king speaks up, saying that she was the impressive one, surprising her as if he had read her mind. He ignores her reaction, stating he had been very close to death, but she'd have healed him in very little time. Something Al-Khalifa responds to by saying she's just a healer, which the boy finds offensive and makes it clear he didn't think of her as just anything. The bubble interrupts the conversation, saying that even though they just reunited, now wasn't the time to flirt, and jokes asking if the queen was looking for a husband, which leaves her outraged. The king even mutters about not having any reproductive organs, making the bubble question if that was really important, and Al-Khalifa steps in, telling them to cut the jokes. Our boy asks if he should tell the girl that they get married as soon as the war ends, but the bubble says it's better not to, playing along. And speaking of bad things, she warns that the Enlightened were back, asking if they were ready to attack now. Slime receives confirmation from his friend, who quickly activates his sword. Observing the beast in front of him, he knew it was time to go. So he leaps toward the dragon, saying he was leaving a big part of the plan in his friend's hands, so he had to cooperate to make everything work, while throwing his sword into the air in a spiral. This movement draws Gilly's attention, who becomes confused about what was happening. She didn't know where the Demon King was heading or why he was ignoring her. He really was a very troublesome guy. Even so, she had already prepared to use long-range attacks to stay clear of any traps, so she'd finish off his two companions first. But everyone is struck by an unexpected flash of light that even startles the Enlightened, because now the protagonist was above the clouds and she finally realizes her opponent was trying to change the weather. That way he would stop the teeters of the saints. Either way, it was too late, as her dragon had already drunk plenty of holy water, and she commands it to move forward, explaining that it wouldn't change the outcome of the battle. At that moment, the attacks the girl had planned explode before even reaching the protagonist's two friends. Apparently, they had repaired the elves' fire barrier and made it much stronger than before. In that scenario, everything she had prepared for long-range attacks was too weak to handle it, so she'd have to act using her own strength. She couldn't believe she would have to destroy the barrier on her own. It was definitely the worst feeling one could have in a situation like that. Her driving gets closer and closer to the city walls. Meanwhile, the bubble talks to Al-Khalifa, saying the enemies had arrived and confirms if she already knew the plan. Something the girl answers with yes, and says she was more than ready. Now the two of them were going to defeat the Enlightened in front of them, who is surprised by a kind of metal rain. When she looks up, she realizes it was a black armor, and now the Demon King was charging at her in a surprise attack that this time worked. The protagonist throws the dragon to the ground as if it were nothing. There was no way it would win against him. Now with the beast on the ground, the king calls out to Gilia so they can settle their issues once and for all. Slime asks how his friend is feeling to make sure he's doing better than when the two were alone back at the base. And he said he had his limits, but he was much stronger than before and could fight. Gilia didn't understand what was wrong with that guy. Everyone knew a dragon was a very strong beast to face like that, yet the Demon King managed to unleash all his magical power. And it wasn't even a normal dragon. It was one of the strongest dragons in existence, their king. Even so, it was nothing against the trio, which made her think they had some connection with the Dark Lord. Extremely furious, the girl stomped her foot, complaining about the hero who had been too lazy when he fought him. She was already tired and couldn't keep up with that nonsense. But she had also come too far to retreat, so she would find a way to reach them and defeat them. The dragon remained standing, roaring loudly like a true beast does. With each step it took, Diana trembled, holding onto him even tighter. The Enlightened One looked on with hatred and without knowing what to do. After all, her enemy now was the Demon King in a much larger form than she was used to. Our boy thought they could win that fight, even if it was against an enlightened one, especially that one who didn't even like being on the front lines. All of her strength came from her pawns, her soldiers, her giant magical items, and dragons. She used them to attack. That way, she weakened her enemies and strengthened her own forces, which served more to protect her than to attack her opponents. Throwing her powers at the monster, she shouted that he was trash, and she had no time for that. But the queen shouted back, stating that she wasn't good at direct combat. Being supported by the bubble in her position, who said that the dragon was strong, they could easily separate the two. Meanwhile, Julia kept being surprised by the strong abilities of her direct opponents, who advanced toward the girl without fear. At that point, she had already realized they were trying to isolate her, but wondered if they thought they could fight her alone. After all, who did they think she was? She had spent hundreds of years on the brink of death, so that situation was nothing different, and she could get through it more easily than when she fought with God himself from there. In the middle of that confusion, the dragon and the Demon King continued in a hand-to-hand battle, until the protagonist used his chaos spells very well known around there, piercing the creature with multiple spikes that rose from the ground. He approached, saying he had already realized that its strength didn't come from its body or supernatural powers, but from the ability to regenerate. The problem for his opponents was that now he knew how to take down the same enemy over and over again, so he could show how many times he could come back to life. Sometime later, Julia was already out of patience, asking if his opponents were going to keep bothering him for much longer. In front of him, the bubble along with Khalifa said that guys who chase girls were usually very annoying. They regretted it, cried, and went too far. Then he cast the recently spell toward the girl, shooting multiple arrows. They already knew the girl was bad at close combat, but hadn't predicted one thing. She was using her weakness as an advantage, making several trees grow where she was supposed to be hit, until the bubble's shield was pierced by something they knew very well. Tarak's sword, seeing that the queen's expression completely changed, overtaken by shock. Noticing this, Slime asked her not to let Gilead provoke her because she was just trying to unbalance the two of them. Besides, if she was still trying to gain the upper hand, it was because she was still struggling, which meant they were winning. Handing the old friend's sword to Khalifa, he said that if she took it, she could finish the girl off with it. But for now, the pursuit would continue. The pair reached a point where they had managed to corner her, as there was only one path and the forest split. The creature explained that if Gilead moved diagonally, they could capture her quickly because she couldn't escape so easily. She might be able to use her abilities to move faster, but most of the vines were in the middle of the forest. In that case, they didn't need to use too much power there and could attack from different angles to confuse her. After all, if she couldn't use the things around her to attack the duo, all she had left was herself, and she didn't have much strength left. It was now or never, and he motivated his friend to move forward. As they entered that dense forest, the girl found it strange because it was very dark, but her companion explained that it was just because it was a forest. Even so, she insisted that the feeling was that something was wrong. Noticing the girl's hesitation, he explains that they were almost out of the forest. They needed to act now, but for that, he would need her support. When they finally got out, the wooden monster screamed, determined to wipe out the Enlightened One's race. However, it saw something it definitely didn't expect, a huge tree full of energy sprouting from the ground. Diana tried to hold it back with one of her spells, but in the end, Julia was enlightened with enough power for the trees to cross in front of her. That's when the bubble realized she had been wrong. It wasn't them chasing the girl, but rather her who had lured them there ever since they entered the forest. Thinking about it, she concluded it must have gotten dark because the trees around them were taller than normal, which meant walking that path drained them mentally and physically. Her speech is interrupted when a huge tree sprouts from the ground out of nowhere. On the other side, Julia mentally thanked her spiritual armor that had saved her. Then she crafted an arrow from scratch with her own hands. She knew the barrier she had created worked, which meant she could destroy it. Though she acknowledged that the two companions had been persistent in the fight, then her arrow pierced one of the stumps, destroying it completely. Farther away, the Demon King noticed things didn't seem to be going well in his friend's fight and even wanted to help them. But it wasn't something he could do at the moment because he was very busy with a certain creature. The dragon in front of him kept getting stronger, and it didn't even seem like it was using any kind of magic. The creature removed its restraints using only its own strength, a simple but very effective move, because it had removed the safety restrictions to preserve its life, using all the power it had, even knowing it could destroy itself. Moreover, it combined its regeneration power purely to attack the protagonist. However, if it used its full strength, it would benefit the Demon King greatly, who continued insisting in the fight against the beast in front of him. He told the monster to squeeze even more life out of him because all he needed was just a little more time. Behind him, the Wooden Knight's battle raged on. He had to admit the girl was strong and a good strategist because she hadn't attacked them on the way, so they lowered their guard. He needed to take a gamble since the queen was already very close to her limits, and she was the one holding the barrier that protected them. Then the bubble said she got risky plans with a low chance of success. Even so, she wanted to count on the queen, who turned to her, desperate. but her expression turned into a big smile as she said that had been their deal from the beginning. With that support, she began explaining her plan, asking if she thought she could fit inside the wooden soldier, something Al-Khalifa believed was possible. According to her, it was a very important part of the plan, and first they needed to survive that attack. Since the fallen trees were strong, they would block Yali's line of sight, so her spears wouldn't be accurate. They could go behind the trees that were still standing, because if they fell near their roots, it would be hard to escape from them, forming a pile of wood that would serve as a good disguise. The bet was that if they tried hard enough, they might get close to Gilia. Of course, the girl would resist them with all her strength, so they have to do something unexpected, like a direct attack from the queen. Meanwhile, Gilia watched the two and commented on how reckless they were. It would be hard to force a path to her and impossible to do it without injuries, especially now that they were wounded and definitely not at their full attack potential. So she knew they'd try to avoid her attacks and maybe climb a big tree nearby, which she thought was a really dumb idea. But she knew they'd have to try because just moving forward among all those fallen trees was hard and there wasn't enough cover in the other paths. They would probably hide to try to attack her or something like that. So Gilia would stop them as soon as they entered her field of vision, especially the soldier. Aiming her arrow, she concluded they should arrive at about that spot. And that's exactly what happened, making the girl shoot precisely at the guy's helmet. She seemed satisfied until she realized something was wrong. Only his helmet had fallen, which indicated it was just a trap. Hidden behind the tree, Slime was talking with the queen, saying that going to the center really had been the worst part, but they had managed to escape from there somehow. But they were spotted by Gilia, who quickly tried to hit them unsuccessfully. Her arrow was shattered. She was dying of rage when she began to aim again. But her spears are taken from her hands. Now that she was out of ammunition, it was the duo's chance to capture her. And with a leap, the queen jumps out from inside that armor as all of them fall. Gilia laughs, asking if they had a plan B and complimenting their cleverness. But it was a coincidence because she also had one, and she points a magical object at Al-Khalifa, who screams in desperation. The Enlightened explains that it was something specially made to pierce metal and could even break through magical barriers. With a psychopathic look, the bubble apologizes, stating they had a plan C while a knife is embedded in the middle of the queen's forehead. That really takes the girl by surprise. She was shocked because it was a creature from the Emperor's era, 1,000 years ago. Mocking her, the bubble says the girl seemed to know a lot, asking if she was some kind of smarty pants or what. The girl was still falling to the ground while Al-Khalifa waited for her with her friend Tarek's sword, stating that she had already lived too long. Gilia reached them like a proper shish kebab, no more and no less. They had finally won. Even so, the queen cried, so the Enlightened asks why she was like that, and if it was the first time she had taken someone down, because if so, it was really scary and hard. She explains that she was just like the snake in front of her when she started, but now she was used to it. Lying on the ground, she says that if she had known things would end that way, she would have preferred to go sooner, until the head of the dragon that was fighting the Demon King is launched into the air, falling near the group, which makes Gilia laugh, and declare that her dragon was the best trump card she used, and even so, the monsters finished it off easily. At that moment, the king enters the forest, worried, saying he had rushed, but apparently everything was fine. Now was the end for the Enlightened, who had already accepted her fate and had just one question. She says the dragon was specialized in strength and regeneration to survive anything, so it must not have been easy to kill it. That's why she wanted to know how the protagonist did it, and he replies that it wouldn't be easy to kill it in a normal battle, but he also didn't think he would win. So he devoured it. Since the beast still had a lot of power in it, the MC comments that she must have sacrificed many people for that, and Gilia explains that she wasn't exactly an ally of the humans, which makes the group ask if she wasn't an elf. And the Enlightened explains that according to her people, she was responsible for connecting them and the humans. Her words make the queen realize something she hadn't noticed before. Gilia wasn't just any elf, she was a shadow elf. And the girl makes a point to say it wasn't just that, because she was the first of her race and decides to tell that story. A long time ago, there was a clan that worshipped the goddess of the forests, and this group was called the Elves. One day, a genius baby was born, and that was Gilia. It didn't take long for her to become the smartest in the clan, helping to develop their civilization. Thanks to her, their technology spread. From the deepest forest to the depths of the ocean, they searched every corner of the world to discover everything that could be discovered, until the day came when the elves already knew everything. Little by little, the knowledge accumulated and brought them closer to the truth like never before. But unfortunately, it also brought them closer to their destruction. The girl lived in the library, praised by the elders for her discoveries about the creation of the universe itself. They kept saying there were paranormal beings in that world and that they fought many wars, and they suggested they could use that information to get closer to their goddess. One of the elves said that the more they dug into the past, the more they discovered the reasons behind the problems they were facing in the present, like a decline in the current population. Hearing that, Julia asks if he was referring to the family records that didn't match, justifying it by saying they used a different categorization in the past. But the man denies it. Before he could finish his sentence, a large opening appears in the room. With the arrival of some people amidst all that light, one of the hooded figures concludes that this was the nest of that arrogant and petty race that needed to be destroyed, declaring themselves the true disciples of the goddess ready to carry out her orders, using powers like the flame of sin to strike that people. They had marked everyone there because of their color and were supposed to finish them all. They now had a name, Dark Elves. One of the knights approaches Gilia, who suddenly vanishes, being insulted by his companion who claimed they needed to wipe them all out without exception. That day, everything was taken from those people, and anyone who tried to resist would lose their life. With people fleeing, the group couldn't unite in their escape to avoid being captured. She decided to wait, so she stopped growing and just kept waiting. She waited so long that the cliffs turned into sand. Her civilization was now in ruins, and she was placed into a new generation, found by a cloaked knight who claimed the girl was a survivor from the old times and must cooperate. They decided to use the girl, who was one of the Dark Elves, as she could enter their hideouts. Now her mission was to find and eliminate all of her descendants. Hearing that order, the girl screamed, questioning who the knight thought he was since he had taken everything from them, and she would rather die alone than destroy her own. But the man showed no sympathy, reminding her that she was using the fire of sin, which at that moment only affected her descendants. However, it could spread to all members of her species. Amid tears, she already had to decide whether she wanted to eliminate only her descendants or witness an entire species become extinct. In a new disguise, the girl followed the orders from above, meeting a friendly elf who welcomed her to the small community. She was surprised before letting out a small, kind laugh, but she wiped out the entire village in an instant without hesitation to stay on mission. However, when she found a crying baby in a basket, she realized she would have to make some effort, pressing the dagger there with closed eyes so as not to suffer even more. Even so, the little creature seemed to resist, and the girl struck incessantly, desperately hoping he would just go away. When finally left in a deplorable state, Gilly picked him up, screaming in despair and remorse. She recognized that from that moment on, she was no longer intelligent, but rather a tool of destruction that couldn't even die if she wanted to, and revealed that Dark Elves didn't exist. It was a category created by future generations who wanted to differentiate themselves from hers. Even though she was laughing while saying it, the queen stated that it wasn't funny at all. And despite hating the Enlightened One, she wouldn't laugh at her pain. She had hurt many people, and now she was there laughing on the brink of death. She was truly a despicable creature. Diana made sure to clarify that no matter what had happened in her past, she wouldn't forget what she'd done to them, as she was the worst of all. However, she would forgive her, not because she liked her, but because they were nearing the end, and it was time to forgive themselves. Hearing this, Yulia asked why all this kindness out of nowhere and pulling her into a hug. Anna explained that it was because it was very hard to die without proper closure. It was alright because she had heard her story and now forgave her. She wouldn't let her die alone. Squeezing tighter in the hug, the queen reaffirmed that it was alright, until Gilia broke into tears, giving in to that kindness. At that point, the Enlightened One shouted that she should have been the first to die. Now it was too late to fix things, and she felt she should pass on in great pain. She shouldn't be forgiven and should be remembered as a fool. Even so, Al-Khalifa took her hand, saying she knew it was hard and that the girl was very tired. But everything had already been forgiven, and now she could sleep somewhere far away. A man waited for news at the edge of a cliff, being approached by a messenger raven that was supposed to tell all the kings they should gather with the ancestral fire. And the long-haired man was surprised by someone asking if the one who should hear those words wasn't exactly human. Such a statement came from the hero's mouth. But the old man asked why that mattered to him, hearing in response that he must know some of the world's secrets, and the young man was there because he wanted information about some of them. Kazudoi turned toward him, asking if the boy really should be lurking around like a pawn. While half the enlightened ones were dead, the young man replied that he had no right to bring up that topic at that moment. But Kazudoi didn't care and asked if he wasn't the strongest enlightened one of all. Laughing, the elder explained that it was the king who had stopped him, and he was only following his orders. Besides, the boy said he wanted to know the secrets because all heroes were the same. There were no secrets, only here and now. And that was exactly what he couldn't see and never would see. The man concluded by saying that was all he had to say to him, and you could do whatever you wanted with that. Outraged, the hero explained that none of that would help him, but Kazudoi told him to stop asking and go fight for it. After all, humans lived within possibilities, but the hero was no longer human, had no empathy, and didn't need their stories. Holding his sword, the old man decided to reveal only one thing to the pupil, that heroes were his enemies. They didn't meet him in their world, and had always been that way, and all that preciousness just made him sick. So he sliced off the piece of land that separated them, sending him away, shattering the cliff's edge. From above, Kazudoi told him to find the goddess or go to the temple to ask what he wanted somewhere else. Only then would he learn what shame was, since he threw away his chance of being just a human. Because according to him, only those who rose from the depths of despair should be called heroes. Reaching the end of his fall, the hero asked where he was. As he couldn't see anything, he concluded that he must have fallen into an immeasurable depth, until he saw a light, which seemed to guide the way, so he decided to follow it. As he walked, he reflected on how Kazudo's hostility was genuine. He was a human who hated the hero with a furious confidence that he didn't have within himself. Before that point, all of his actions were guided by conviction and confidence, but now his reality was falling apart in his hands, making him wonder what a hero was, if he was the king's left hand or just an apostle of the goddess. But he knew he had to be something more. A hero should persist even when nothing is in their favor, setting an example for the people. Thinking about that, he tried to center himself in his courage to overcome that trial, because no matter how cruel the truth was, he had to keep going. After all, he was the hero. Continuing and trusting the path, the young man descended even further, landing in the absolute sanctuary that was forbidden to all there, the Tavern of the Goddess. The hero was surprised by a voice stating that there was no place for stupidity there, and he was already a lost cause. There was someone with a huge hood suggesting the guy go back if he didn't want to suffer, saying he shouldn't ask anything, just turn around to keep being considered a hero, unless he chose to duel there in the midst of sin. At that moment, the hero recognized that silhouette, belonging to someone mentioned in every history book, with several statues scattered around and his face stamped on the national currency. It was the original hero, Coleman Jakinden. When he finally spoke, the boy made sure to show he knew who he was talking to, confirming the identity of his younger brother. But all the man replied was that his brother had already told the boy in front of him to turn back and question what happened to the honest and well-behaved hero he had heard about, asking if with that attitude, he was hoping to feel the fury of the goddess, leaving him in silence for a moment, until the boy spoke, stating that he was taught to trust and believe. But something was very wrong in that world, because even though they had defeated the Dark Lord, a third of humanity died every year. With the goddess's protection, no one died from hunger or illness. All wars had ended years ago, and murder was something left in the past, which made him wonder if those deaths were the result of monster attacks. That's why he conducted an experiment by building a barrier and exterminating all monsters around it. But even after that, mortality rates remained at 1/3 of the population every year. In the records of his kingdom, most of the deaths were attributed to beast attacks. Where were these people going? He asked. He found it all abominable because it clearly had the hand of the kingdom in it, indicating that the royalty and the gods were hiding something he needed to know. He wanted to reveal the whole truth to the people, and their voices had to be heard, threatening the original hero if he decided to stand between the truth and the people. And drawing his sword, he declared he would defeat him if necessary. Meanwhile, Coleman Jakinden thought it was all a big joke and questioned whether the blonde really thought he could beat him. But the boy stood firm, saying that the creature in front of him had received his strength as a gift, while he had to fight for his. Outside of there, the messenger raven arrived at a cave, finding Hellfire, who confirmed that it had begun. He then asked the little one to deliver the message to all the kings that the time had come. Their leader was with him and wanted them all to gather right there. At the end of his message, he set the bird free. He seemed upset to be the leader and still have to face even more suffering, and he couldn't force all of that on him now because he wasn't worthy. Back at the castle taken by monsters, the Demon King sighed, complaining that now it was time for manual labor. He had to help everyone as much as possible because even in that state, they still needed him. Someone entered the protagonist's room with unmatched excitement. It was Chief Crow announcing that it was time to get up because it was already morning. He was impressed by the fact that they had won that battle, as it wasn't something he believed would happen, and he deeply thanked the Demon King, who deflected the compliment by saying everyone deserved credit, besides calling that a victory was contradictory, because too much juice had been spilled along the way. Even so, the leader argued that if he hadn't been there, no one would have survived, so he would keep thanking him. One of the monsters walked toward the Demon King, calling him because something serious was happening. A group of lunatics demanded to speak with the protagonist. And it wasn't just any group of lunatics, but people close to the Dark Lord who controlled the North. Before heading out to meet them, the guy asked if anyone was injured, which wasn't the case, and if there were any weapons, but they only had an axe and their fists. Asking permission from the local leader, the Demon King set off for the front gate. Meanwhile, the slime had to deal with that arrogant group saying they wanted to speak with the guy who took down the Enlightened One and not with Little Beansprout. Already out of patience, the slime said the guy would be there soon, until the creature announced his entrance, apologizing for the delay. He found two truly dark beings. The boy promptly greeted him as the slayer of the Enlightened One, saying the monsters had already spread rumors that he would be the next Dark Lord. That nickname surprised the protagonist, and the slime confirmed that the goblins were spreading that word. Anyway, that wasn't the important issue at the moment. He just wanted to know what the duo wanted from him, explaining that, as one could tell by the state of the fortress gate, everyone was very tired because of the battle and needed rest. They didn't want trouble. With that, he took the opportunity to ask if they could just be left in peace. But the boy denied his request and said he had gathered all the leaders there as his witnesses, because they would witness the rise of a new Dark Lord, and it would be him. So why would he care if the Demon King was weak, since he valued the survival of the strongest, and that's what he loved about that world. Assuming a dark expression, the boy declared he would destroy the protagonist, only to be interrupted by someone asking them to listen to a bit of what he had to say before starting. He claimed that the protagonist was very special and was his boss. His presence surprised everyone there. It was Misty Kinner, the warrior who had disappeared for a while during the war, an old acquaintance of the Demon King, who pointed at him saying he wasn't just any old man, but a great elder. Hearing those words come from the man's mouth left Caron speechless, because the elders were at the top of the pyramid, but the protagonist was at the very top of the top. And Meiji Kinner said he didn't know how crazy he was, but he was willing to do anything, including the fact that protagonist was only amazing because no one knew just how right he was. The king wasn't listening to anything they were saying and didn't understand, so he just kept commenting to the slime. Carol asked what she and Luna should do about that opponent who seemed far too strong for both of them. But the dark-haired girl remained unmoved, refusing to accept that. So she declared they wouldn't give up before fighting because it was in their nature to do so. That's why she would test him, proving that his bluffs wouldn't work on her. The girl charged forward with her massive axe, but it didn't seem to intimidate the Demon King at all. Seeing his lack of reaction, Macy Kinner shouted to him that Luna wasn't playing around and told him to be careful, because those warriors were protectors of the god of evil and their abilities made them immune to blades. And the girl's attacks had already taken down several people who fell immediately from just a small touch of her axe. Even so, the Demon King remained unfazed. So the girl came at him with everything, driving her blade into the man. But something surprised Caron, and even Luna couldn't understand what happened, because there was her axe blade embedded in the ground, completely shattered. The protagonist apologized in case the girl had any emotional attachment to the object, but reminded her that she threw the first blow and asked if they could just finish that already. Of course she wouldn't be happy. I didn't really know what I would do, but if I killed him, he would just keep coming back. Surprisingly, the girl just said that from that moment on, she would call the protagonist her older brother. Now that was a proper response. Hearing that, Caron asked if that meant the king had become her younger brother, but Luna confirmed he would be the older brother of both of them. The slime pointed to his friend, saying he had been promoted to brother. Carol approached the protagonist, saying she would tell all the leaders that he was the Dark Lord. But before they joined his group, she needed to assess whether their values at least somewhat aligned, because they weren't just a huge army that defeated the Enlightened Ones. She showed the reality of the people there, recovering little by little. The protagonist made sure to clarify that they were in ruins and not victors, but survivors who had barely managed to protect that castle. They had very little food, not enough tools, much less places to sleep, and one more attack would wipe them out completely, something that happened only because they fought humans, which made it clear they couldn't fight other monsters and didn't have time for that. Now that everything was on the table, they could decide whether or not to join that group. But a crying harpy child caught the attention of both of them, and the king asked Caron to try to calm the little one, something he found absurd. However, he was reprimanded, being told there was no reason to act with violence. The boy approached the harpy child, getting her attention and asking her to stop crying and just smile. Clearly, that attempt didn't work, and the little girl burst back into tears. So the guy asked her again to stop crying, questioning what was wrong that had made her like that. That's when another group of children approached her, asking what had happened, why she was crying, and if she was okay. The girl revealed that her mother hadn't come back, and one of the children said she probably wouldn't come back, asking what the crying girl's name was. She introduced herself as Rita, being praised by the little ones around her, who said her mother had to travel far away. But while she wasn't back, she could wait there with them. That finally made the little girl stop crying, and she smiled in agreement. One of the children gave her a piece of candy, which made her even happier. Observing the scene, the guy asked if the goal of that was to embarrass him. But the Demon King denied it, explaining that the same thing had happened to him, and it was at the very least a memorable experience. He remembered when he tried to logically explain to a crying child in front of him that she should just stop. But the other harpy children helped a lot and were able to calm her immediately. With that, he said he wasn't very strong because he couldn't even console a child. However, the community there helped each other, and it was only because of that he was still alive. So if someone was looking for a self-sufficient lord, they'd have to find someone else, because he didn't want to be a useless lord and would find his own place so he wouldn't have to steal someone else's. That left the siblings speechless. And the slime explained that what his friend meant was that strength wasn't the most important thing in a friendship. His words made Caron grumble, saying he got the point. Inside the base, the crow asked if there was anything else to resolve, because that pair seemed strangely connected, but he let it go since he was glad things hadn't taken a violent turn. Carol confessed she didn't understand much of that whole speech, but had already made her decision along with Luna, and they would stay by his side. Apparently, the Demon King would have to add another faction there, so he asked for all the community leaders in the base to be gathered. He had to acknowledge that it was past time they came together to discuss what to do next. And so they did, bringing representatives from all the groups into a small meeting. One of them even commented on being a bit nervous. Queen Al-Khalifa, with her refreshed attire, presented herself there, and the king noticed the new clothes she wore, subtly complimenting her, saying he really liked them because they looked good on the girl, who clearly got shy and didn't believe his words. She explained that she wanted proper clothes for battle, so she asked the creative master to make them for her. Now she wouldn't have to bring her crown to the battlefield. Diana took the chance to compliment the guy, saying he no longer looked like a scared puppy, which led him to conclude that the incident with that dragon wasn't all bad. Changing the subject, she states that most of the chiefs were already there, so they should join them. Entering the meeting space, the Demon King confidently says that this meeting would decide his entire destiny. The Raven states that most of the committee was already there, and the Demon King thanks all of them for their presence. Beginning the long-awaited meeting, he starts by informing that the warriors had asked to join the group and the protagonists saw nothing wrong with it, but wanted to know if the others agreed. One of the chiefs says that if it meant the army would be strengthened, they would accept any kind of people. He is supported by a skeleton king. The queen also speaks, stating that she had been in their place before, so she had nothing to complain about either. With that out of the way, they could start discussing what their plans would be. For now, they had only two options. The first was to stay there, rebuild the castle, and strengthen their weaponry and army. The second was to head to the territory of a monster called the Storm Lord, as he had received an invitation from the ruler himself and wanted to know what the others thought. The Raven says he has an objection. According to him, they should leave as there was no reason to stay there in that godforsaken place. But Kuron says they could continue fighting there and reminds him that he and his sister would follow him, boasting that he had already escaped from the Flaming Lion before. However, for the leader, military strength was not the only important factor. According to him, stating there was a logistical matter, as they no longer had any resources. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell, and see you next time on Tob's channel.